Welcome back to Mr. Cursed. Today's different, guys. I found 7 stories from people who actually grew up in the Appalachian Mountains, and man, their childhood was not normal. Things watching them from the trees, strange holes in the ground, creatures that learned their names. This is the kind of stuff that sticks with you forever. Quick reminder, subscribe if you haven't already, smash that like button, and let me know in the comments where you're from. I appreciate all of you. Now, let's get into it because story 1 is absolutely crazy. I was 12 when my family moved to a rental house in Bone Hollow, Virginia, and honestly, I should have known something was wrong just from the name. My dad had lost his trucking job with Patterson Transport after 20 years when they downsized, and Mom was only working part-time at Sheer Beauty Salon in town, so we needed something cheap. The house in Bone Hollow was dirt cheap, and now I know why. I'm Emma Carter, and I'm 31 now. I work as a medical records clerk in Richmond. Got married 5 years ago to a good man who knows better than to ask too many questions when I wake up screaming some nights. We've got a little girl on the way, due in March, and I've been thinking a lot lately about that summer in Bone Hollow. My husband thinks we should move closer to the mountains when the baby comes, somewhere quiet and peaceful. I just smile and nod, but there's no way in hell I'm ever going back to those woods. Dad was between trucking companies that summer, picking up odd jobs wherever he could find them. The moving truck driver who helped us load our stuff at the old place in Roanoke was this weathered guy named Dale who'd been hauling furniture for 30 years. When Dad gave him the address in Bone Hollow, Dale's face went white. "Y'all sure about that address?" he asked, checking his clipboard twice. "Strange things happen in Bone Hollow. Animals avoid it, hunters won't go there. Something ain't right about that place." Dad just laughed it off. We didn't have much choice in the matter. The house itself wasn't too bad. A 2-story rental from the 1,970 seconds, with blue vinyl siding and a decent-sized yard. What struck me first was the silence. I'd lived in the suburbs my whole life, used to hearing dogs barking, kids playing, lawnmowers on Saturday mornings. But Bone Hollow was dead quiet. No birds singing, no insects buzzing, no normal forest sounds, just this oppressive quiet that made my ears ring. Our first day there, while Mom was unpacking kitchen boxes and Dad was trying to get the water heater working, I decided to explore the property. We had about 2 acres, mostly wooded, with a little creek running along the back boundary. That's when I found the first bone pile. It was hidden behind a cluster of oak trees, maybe 50 yards from the house. At first I thought it was just where some animal had died naturally, but when I looked closer, I realized how wrong that was. The bones were arranged in a perfect circle, deer ribs forming the outer ring, smaller bones from rabbits and birds spiraling inward, all picked completely clean and white as fresh snow. Not a scrap of meat or hide anywhere. The precision was mathematical, like someone had used a ruler and compass. I called for Dad, and he came tramping through the underbrush with his work boots and tool belt, expecting to see a snake or maybe a wasp nest. When he saw the bone circle, he stopped dead. "Well, that's something you don't see every day," he said, but I could tell it bothered him. He poked at the bones with a stick, and they were dry and brittle, like they'd been there for months. Over the next few days, I found 11 more bone arrangements scattered throughout our property. All different animals, possums, raccoons, a couple more deer, dozens of birds, all cleaned to perfection and arranged in geometric patterns. Circles, triangles, straight lines that pointed toward our house like arrows. From my bedroom window on the 2nd floor, I could see how they formed a larger pattern, a kind of spiral with our house at the center. The smell was the worst part, not decay. These bones were too clean for that, but something chemical and sharp, like bleach, mixed with wet metal. It was strongest around the bone piles, but it seemed to hang in the air throughout the hollow, especially in the early morning when the mist was thick. Mom found a box of missing pet flyers in the kitchen junk drawer, left behind by the previous tenants. Dozens of cats and dogs had vanished in Bone Hollow over the past few years. Mittens, last seen near Hollow Creek Road. Boxer mix named Duke, please call if found. The dates went back 3 years, and there were way too many for a normal rural area where pets might just wander off or get hit by cars. I started paying attention to the patterns more carefully. From my bedroom, I could see that the bone arrangements followed specific geometric rules. They weren't random predation, something was organizing them, creating a kind of map or territory marker system. The arrangements were too deliberate, too perfect to be natural. By our first week in Bone Hollow, I knew something was fundamentally wrong with the place. The very air felt hostile, like the forest itself was watching and waiting. When I mentioned this to Mom, she just said it was probably because I missed our old neighborhood. But even she admitted the silence was unnerving. That's when I first saw it. I was in my room around sunset, doing homework at the desk by the window, when movement caught my eye. Something large and pale was moving between the trees behind our house, too far away to see clearly, but moving with this fluid gait that didn't match any animal I knew. It wasn't the loping run of a deer or the lumber of a bear. It moved like it was dancing or floating. I watched it for maybe 10 minutes, trying to figure out what I was seeing. It never came closer to the house, just moved back and forth along the tree line like it was patrolling. When I called for Dad to bring his binoculars, the thing melted back into the woods and disappeared. The next evening, it was back. This time, I was ready with Dad's Bushnell binoculars, and I got a good look. 8 feet tall, easy, with a humanoid shape but all wrong proportions. Its skin was pale and looked wet, almost translucent in places. The limbs were too long and seemed to bend in too many places, like it had extra joints. The head was the worst part. Vaguely human in shape but stretched vertically, with features I couldn't quite make out in the fading light. It wasn't hunting like a normal predator. Instead, it was studying our house, watching our windows for hours at a time. Sometimes it would tilt its head in this bird-like way, like it was listening to sounds I couldn't hear. Other times it would shift position, getting different angles on our property, but always maintaining that respectful distance. The creature was rearranging the bone piles overnight. I'd marked the positions of several arrangements in my mind, and by morning they'd been moved, reorganized into new patterns that seemed to focus more directly on our house. It was marking territory, but also communicating something. The bone spirals were getting tighter, the arrows pointing more clearly toward our windows. One evening, I watched it catch a deer. I was doing dishes after dinner when I saw the deer grazing near the creek, maybe 60 yards from the house. The creature emerged from the tree line with that flowing movement, and I expected the deer to bolt. Instead, something impossible happened. The deer just stopped, froze completely, like someone had hit a pause button. The creature approached slowly, reached out with one of those 2 long arms, and touched the deer's neck. The deer's eyes went blank, and then it simply followed the creature back into the woods, walking calmly to its own death. I dropped the plate I was washing. The crash brought Mom running, and when I tried to explain what I'd seen, she looked at me like I was having some kind of breakdown. "Honey, you've been stressed about the move?" she said. "Sometimes our eyes play tricks on us when we're anxious." But I knew what I'd seen. The creature had some kind of control over its prey, some way of shutting down their survival instincts. That's how it caught animals without a chase, without struggle, without disturbing the perfect arrangements of bones it left behind. I started watching more carefully. The creature would emerge most evenings around sunset, always from a different section of the woods, but always maintaining that territorial patrol pattern. It would study our house, rearrange bone markers, and sometimes disappear for hours before returning with a fresh kill. The processing behavior was surgical. I watched it strip a raccoon using only its hands, working with methodical precision. The flesh came away in neat sections, and the bones were cleaned completely but never broken or damaged. It worked like a butcher who'd been doing the same job for decades, every movement economical and practiced. The bone piles were appearing closer to our house. What had started as a wide perimeter was contracting, the territorial markers moving inward toward our property line. Each morning, I'd find new arrangements a few feet closer to our back door, and the geometric patterns were becoming more complex, more focused. The creature was showing specific interest in our family. It would emerge when Dad worked in the yard, positioning itself where it could watch him repair the fence or stack firewood. When Mom hung laundry on the back line, it would appear at the forest edge, studying her movements with that tilted head attention. And at night, I'd sometimes see it outside my bedroom window, just standing there in the darkness. It started making sounds, not quite speech, but complex vocalizations that seemed directed at our house. Long, melodic tones that would rise and fall like a conversation, always coming from different positions around our property. It was trying to communicate something, establish some kind of contact protocol. One evening in late July, everything changed. I was helping Dad with dinner dishes when the motion sensor light on our back porch suddenly blazed on. Through the kitchen window, we saw the creature standing right at our back door. Dad grabbed the baseball bat he kept by the coat closet and slowly opened the door. They stared at each other for a full minute. Dad with the bat raised, the creature perfectly still with its head tilted in that studying pose. Up close, its skin looked like wet plastic, and I could see gills or slits along its elongated neck that opened and closed like it was breathing water instead of air. "Biggest damn albino I ever seen," Dad told Mom afterward, but his hands were shaking when he locked the deadbolt. I could see he was terrified but trying not to show it. That night, he moved his hunting rifle from the closet to the bedroom. The creature started testing boundaries. Each night, it moved a little closer to the house, gauging our reactions. It would approach the porch, then retreat, touch the doorframe, then disappear. Run its fingers along the siding like it was reading Braille, learning the texture and structure of our home. We started finding that chemical smell around our property, the same bleach and metal scent as the hollow, but stronger. The creature was marking our land somehow, claiming it as part of its territory. The smell was strongest around the corners of the house and near our cars, like it was creating scent boundaries. It began leaving gifts on our porch. Perfectly cleaned animal skulls arranged in decorative patterns. A rabbit skull surrounded by bird bones in a flower-like design. A deer skull crowned with a ring of smaller bones. The arrangements were beautiful in a disturbing way, like alien art installations. Mom had her own encounter a few days later. She was taking trash to the curb around 10 p.m. when she came face to face with the creature near our mailbox. Instead of threatening her, it just tilted its head and made soft clicking sounds, like it was trying to have a conversation. Mom stood there for maybe 30 seconds, and then the creature stepped aside to let her pass before melting back into the darkness. It was almost polite, she told us later, which somehow made the whole thing more terrifying. I realized the creature was studying human behavior the same way a scientist studies lab animals. We were specimens in its territory, and it was learning our routines, our relationships, our patterns. It knew when Dad left for job interviews, when Mom worked late shifts at the salon, when I was home alone doing homework. When our neighbor's dog, a golden retriever named Banjo, wandered into the hollow one afternoon, I watched from my window as the creature emerged to investigate. Instead of the paralyzing touch it used on wild animals, it guided Banjo gently back toward the road, like it understood the dog belonged to humans and was off limits. Other animals weren't so lucky. I found fresh bone piles almost daily as the creature systematically cleared its territory of all wildlife. Squirrels, chipmunks, even insects seemed to avoid our property now. We lived in a dead zone where only humans were tolerated. The final warning came in early August. I woke up one morning to find bones arranged in the exact shape of a human figure right outside my bedroom window. Arm bones, leg bones, ribs, even a deer skull positioned where the head would be. The message was unmistakable. It could do to us what it did to everything else in its territory. That's when Dad called the family meeting. We sat around the kitchen table, and Dad laid it out plain. We can't fight this thing, and we can't ignore it anymore. But maybe we can coexist until I find work somewhere else. He'd been putting out applications all over Virginia and North Carolina, and Patterson Transport had hinted they might have an opening in Tennessee. We started treating the creature like a dangerous neighbor instead of a monster. No sudden movements when we saw it, no direct challenges to its authority, just respectful acknowledgement of its presence. When it appeared at the edge of the yard, we'd nod in its direction and go about our business. The creature responded to our new approach. It stopped leaving bone arrangements near the house, though it continued its territorial patrols. The gifts on the porch became less frequent, and it no longer approached our doors. We'd reached some kind of understanding. We were temporary residents in its territory, and as long as we showed proper respect, we'd be tolerated. In late August, Dad got the call from Miller Freight Lines in Nashville. They were offering him a full-time position with benefits, starting in September. We had 2 weeks to pack up and move out of Bone Hollow, which seemed to satisfy whatever intelligence controlled our strange neighbor. On moving day, the creature watched our departure from the forest edge. As Dale's truck pulled our furniture out of the driveway, I saw it standing perfectly still among the trees, like a pale statue marking the boundary of its domain. As we drove away, it raised one elongated arm in what might have been a farewell gesture. Looking back now, 19 years later, I still don't know what we shared those woods with. I've done research, tried to find similar stories, but Bone Hollow seems to be unique. The house has been empty ever since we left. I checked the real estate listings a few years ago, and it's been off the market since 2006. I never went back, and I never will. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night thinking about that chemical smell, or the sound of those melodic vocalizations drifting through the darkness. My husband thinks I have anxiety dreams about work stress, and I let him believe that. Some experiences change you permanently, mark you in ways that never fade. I can't walk through any woods now without feeling watched. I won't go camping, won't even take nature walks in state parks. When we move to our new house next month, I made sure it's in a subdivision with streetlights and sidewalks and the comfortable sounds of human civilization. Whatever lives in Bone Hollow is still there, still arranging its bone patterns and marking its territory, still waiting with infinite patience for the next family desperate enough to rent that cheap house in the Virginia woods. I just hope they're smarter than we were. I hope they listen to the moving truck driver and find somewhere else to live. But part of me knows they won't. When you're desperate and broke and out of options, you take what you can get. Even if it means sharing your backyard with something that shouldn't exist, something that sees you as just another specimen in its vast, patient collection. I still check the Bone Hollow real estate listings sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep. The house is still empty, still waiting. And somewhere in those quiet woods, I know the bone arrangements are still growing, still spiraling outward in patterns too perfect to be natural, marking territory for a creature that remembers every family that ever tried to call that place home. I was 15 when I learned that some legends exist because they're true. My name's Jake Morrison, and I grew up in Pine Hollow, West Virginia, tucked deep in the mountains where everyone knows everyone else's business. Dad worked construction on the new highway project they were building through our valley, and Mom was a nurse at the county hospital. We weren't rich, but we weren't poor either. Just a normal working family that had been in these mountains long enough to know which stories to take seriously and which ones were just talk. Pine Hollow was the kind of place where kids couldn't wait to leave, and adults couldn't imagine living anywhere else. Population maybe 800 on a good day, one main street with a general store, a diner, and a gas station that doubled as the post office. The mountains surrounded us like walls, covered in thick forest that stretched for miles in every direction. Most folks made their living either in coal, timber, or working construction like Dad. It was honest work, but it was hard work, and it aged people fast. Our house sat on about 3 acres at the edge of town, backing up to national forest land. Mom inherited it from her parents, who'd inherited it from theirs. The Morrison family had been in these mountains since before the Civil War, which meant we'd heard all the old stories. Every holler had its tales: phantom dogs, witch lights, things that walked the ridgelines on moonless nights. Most of it was nonsense, ways for old-timers to scare kids or explain away things they didn't understand. But some stories, the ones that got passed down generation after generation with the same details, those were different. The Whistling Man was one of those stories. According to local legend, he appeared on Devil's Backbone Trail during new moons, hunting for teenagers who stayed out past midnight. The trail ran along a narrow ridge about 5 miles north of town, with steep drops on both sides that went down maybe 300 feet into thick woods. It was beautiful during the day. You could see for miles across the valley, but treacherous at night even with good lighting. The Whistling Man was supposed to lure kids off the main path with this haunting melody, and once they followed the sound into the trees, they were never seen again. Old-timers in town swore it was true. Sheriff's Department had files on missing teenagers going back to the 1,960 seconds. All last seen near Devil's Backbone. But the way I figured it, kids got lost in those woods all the time. They'd go up there to drink or fool around, take a wrong turn in the dark, fall down a ravine, or get turned around until they died of exposure. The mountains were dangerous enough without adding monsters to the mix. My friends and I thought it was just another story parents told to keep kids from drinking in the woods. Every small town had some kind of boogeyman legend. Usually involved teenagers doing something they shouldn't and paying for it. Made perfect sense as a cautionary tale. Chris Dalton, my best friend since elementary school, used to joke that the whistling man was probably just some old drunk hermit who lived up in the forest and didn't like company. That October, my girlfriend Ashley Brennan dared our whole group to hike Devil's Backbone on Halloween night. Ashley was new to town. Her family had moved down from Pittsburgh the year before, when her dad got transferred to manage the mine office. She was pretty and smart and had this way of making everything sound like an adventure. "Let's prove it's all bullshit," she said when we were sitting around the diner after school. "New moon, Halloween night, perfect conditions according to the legend. We'll hike the trail, stay until 1 in the morning, take some pictures, and put this stupid story to rest forever." The group that decided to do it included me, Ashley, Chris, his girlfriend Maria Santos, and the Patterson twins, Danny and Dave. 6 of us total, all juniors, except for the twins who were seniors. We planned to meet at the trailhead at 11 p.m., hike to the ridge, and stay until 1 a.m. Chris brought his dad's .38 pistol, just in case, though we were more worried about real dangers, black bears, unstable ground, getting lost in the dark. The idea of actually encountering the whistling man seemed ridiculous. I'd hiked Devil's Backbone plenty of times during the day with Dad and my older brother. It was about a 2-mile trail to the main overlook, mostly uphill through dense forest before opening onto the ridge. The final half-mile ran along the backbone itself, a narrow strip of rock and dirt with steep drops on both sides. On clear days, you could see 3 counties from up there. But at night, especially with no moon, it would be like walking a tightrope blindfolded. Halloween fell on a Saturday that year, which made it easier to sneak out. I told my parents I was staying over at Chris's house, and he told his parents he was staying at mine. The oldest trick in the book, but it worked because our families had known each other forever. The weather was perfect for October in West Virginia, crisp and clear, maybe 40 degrees, with no wind to speak of. Ashley picked me up in her dad's old Ford Explorer around 10:30, and we drove to the trailhead where the others were already waiting. The first hour was fine. We joked around, took pictures with our phones, made fun of how scared we'd been leading up to this. The trail was steeper than I remembered, and our flashlights created weird dancing shadows between the trees, but nothing felt wrong or dangerous. Chris kept making jokes about the whistling man, doing this exaggerated hillbilly voice. "You kids better get off in my mountain, for I whistle you to death." Maria would laugh and punch his arm, telling him to stop being an idiot. Danny and Dave were identical twins who played football and rarely took anything seriously. They spent most of the hike competing to see who could be more obnoxious, throwing pine cones at each other, making weird noises, generally acting like the 18-year-old boys they were. Even Ashley seemed to be having fun, pointing out constellations and taking selfies with the group. The whistling man felt like the stupidest legend ever invented. We reached the main overlook around midnight. Even in the dark, you could sense the huge, empty space dropping away on both sides of the ridge. Our flashlight beams barely penetrated the canopy below, but you could hear the wind moving through the trees hundreds of feet down. It was beautiful in a way that made you feel small and insignificant. We sat on some rocks, shared the snacks we'd brought, and talked about school and Halloween parties and college plans. That's when we heard the whistling. It started exactly at midnight. I know because Ashley was checking her phone for the time when the sound began. A simple melody, haunting and sweet, echoing up from the forest below us. Not loud, but clear enough that we all heard it at the same time. The tune was familiar somehow, like a lullaby you might have heard as a child but couldn't quite remember. Beautiful, but wrong, played in a minor key that made it sound sad and lonely. Probably just some drunk camper, Ashley said, but her voice had lost its earlier confidence. The whistling was too clear, too deliberate to be random. It had structure, intention, like someone was performing rather than just fooling around. And it seemed to come from everywhere at once, bouncing off the trees and rocks until you couldn't pinpoint exactly where it was coming from. "Should we check it out?" Danny asked. Dave elbowed him hard in the ribs. "Shut up, you idiot. We're not going anywhere." But the melody was strangely compelling. Despite the fear that was starting to creep up my spine, I found myself wanting to find the source. It was like hearing a song on the radio that you couldn't get out of your head, except this was happening in real time. My feet were already moving toward the edge of the overlook before I realized what I was doing. "What are we doing?" Chris demanded, grabbing my arm. "We're walking straight into the woods like idiots." He was right. All 6 of us had been moving slowly toward the sound, following game trails that led down from the main path. We'd been walking like sleepwalkers, drawn by that haunting melody without consciously deciding to follow it. I felt like I was waking up from a dream, confused about how I'd ended up 20 feet off the main trail. When we stopped following the sound, the whistling changed. The melody became more urgent, more insistent, rising in pitch and tempo. Then we heard footsteps crashing through the underbrush below us, moving fast in our direction. Heavy footsteps, like someone wearing boots, but irregular, sometimes fast, sometimes slow, sometimes stopping completely before starting again. "Time to go," Maria said, and nobody argued. We turned to head back to the main trail, but the whistling was getting closer. Through the trees, maybe 50 yards down the slope, I caught a glimpse of a tall figure in dark clothes. Even from that distance, something about him looked wrong. Too pale, features too sharp, and when he tilted his head toward us, I swear I could see him smiling. He wasn't running after us, just walking steadily while continuing to whistle. But somehow he was keeping up with our panicked sprint back toward the ridge trail. Every time I looked over my shoulder, he was the same distance behind us, moving through the forest like he knew exactly where we were going. The whistling seemed to come from everywhere now, ahead of us, behind us, off to both sides. It was like he was herding us, controlling our movement through the woods. No matter which direction we ran, the melody stayed at the same volume, the same distance away. We were trapped in some kind of invisible cage, and the whistling man was holding the key. In our panic to reach the main trail, we got separated. The twins went one direction, Ashley and Maria another, while Chris and I tried to circle back toward the overlook. The forest was thick enough that you could lose sight of someone 10 feet away, especially running in the dark with adrenaline making your hands shake so bad you could barely hold a flashlight steady. That's when we heard Danny scream. It came from somewhere down the slope, a sound of pure terror that cut through the night like a knife. Then silence. Dave called his twin's name frantically. "Danny, Danny, where are you?" But got no response except the continued whistling, now coming from a different location entirely. Ashley came running back through the trees, crying hysterically. Maria wasn't with her. "He took her," she sobbed, grabbing onto my jacket. She turned around and he was right there, standing maybe 5 feet away, and then they were both gone. I wanted to go look for Maria, but Chris grabbed my arm. "We need to get out of here," he said. "Now." The whistling had stopped completely, replaced by an oppressive silence that was somehow worse than the haunting melody. No wind, no insects, no small animals moving through the underbrush. Just our panicked breathing and the crunch of leaves under our feet as we stumbled toward what we hoped was the main trail. We found Dave wandering in circles, calling for his brother. His flashlight was dim, the batteries were dying, and he looked like he'd been crying. "I can't find him," he kept saying. "I can't find Danny anywhere." That's when the whistling man emerged from the trees. He was maybe 20 yards away, standing perfectly still between 2 large oak trees. Up close, he was clearly not human. 7 feet tall at least, with fingers that were too long and clothes that looked like they came from decades in the past. His face was the worst part, too pale, too smooth, with features that were almost right but fundamentally wrong, like someone had described a human face to an alien who'd never seen one before. The whistling was coming from somewhere inside his chest, not his mouth. A low, rumbling melody that I could feel in my bones. He tilted his head and studied us like we were specimens in a museum, curious but not particularly concerned about our obvious terror. Chris pulled out his dad's pistol, but when he tried to fire it, nothing happened. Click, 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 the gun wouldn't work. The whistling man watched this with what might have been amusement, though it was hard to read expressions on a face that wasn't quite human. He didn't attack us immediately. Instead, he began to circle our small group, still whistling that hypnotic melody, sometimes stopping to examine one of us more closely. I got the impression he was deciding something, weighing options we couldn't understand. Dave broke first. He'd been getting more and more agitated about his missing twin, and when the whistling man stopped directly in front of him, Dave screamed and charged with a hiking stick he'd picked up somewhere. The creature caught him effortlessly with one impossibly long arm, and then they both simply vanished into the darkness between one blink and the next. Just Ashley, Chris, and me left. The whistling had stopped again, but we could feel him watching us from somewhere in the forest, waiting, planning, deciding which of us to take next. "We have to run," Ashley whispered, "right now." But every direction looked the same, in the dark, and our flashlights were getting dimmer as the batteries died. We had no idea which way led back to the main trail, and the whistling man obviously knew these woods better than we did. Still, staying put seemed like suicide. We picked a direction that felt right and started moving as quietly as possible. Behind us, something large was moving through the trees, matching our pace but staying just out of sight. Occasionally, we'd catch a glimpse of that pale face between the branches, always watching, always following. The forest seemed to go on forever. We should have reached the main trail within 10 minutes, but we'd been walking for what felt like an hour. Our phones had no signal, not unusual this deep in the mountains, and the GPS was showing our location as a blank gray area. It was like the trail had simply stopped existing. When the whistling man appeared again, he was directly in front of us, blocking our path. This time, he wasn't just watching. He was reaching out with those impossibly long fingers, and I could see something like hunger in his two bright eyes. Ashley made the decision for all of us. She pushed Chris and me toward what she thought was the trail, and placed herself between us and the creature. "Run!" she screamed, and we heard her voice cut off as we crashed blindly through the forest. Chris and I ran harder than we'd ever run in our lives, jumping over fallen logs and crashing through brush that tore at our clothes and skin. Behind us, the whistling resumed, but it was getting closer instead of farther away. We were running blind in complete darkness now, our flashlights finally dead, guided only by panic and the hope that we were heading toward safety. Then suddenly we burst out of the trees onto pavement, the new highway that Dad's construction crew was building through the valley. The work lights were still on, casting harsh white illumination across the construction equipment and fresh asphalt. The moment our feet hit the pavement, the whistling stopped completely. We looked back to see the whistling man standing at the forest edge, unable or unwilling to step onto the developed land. He watched us for a long moment, and I swear he looked almost disappointed, then melted back into the trees like he'd never been there at all. The sheriff's department searched Devil's Backbone for 3 days, but found no trace of Danny, Dave, Maria, or Ashley. They were listed as missing hikers, probable accident victims. The official theory was that they'd fallen into one of the deep ravines, and their bodies would eventually be found by hunters or park rangers. Chris and I never told anyone what really happened. Who would have believed us? I moved away for college the next fall and never went back to Pine Hollow except for brief visits to see my parents. Chris did the same. We both got as far from those mountains as we could manage. We tried to stay in touch for a while, but it was too hard. Every conversation brought back memories we were trying to forget. I'm 31 now, married, with a good job as an electrical engineer in Richmond. Normal life, normal problems. But I still hear that whistling in my nightmares sometimes, and I've never been hiking alone since that night. My wife thinks I'm paranoid about camping and outdoor activities, but she doesn't know why. I've never told her the real reason I won't take our kids to the mountains. Because some legends exist because they're true. And the whistling man is still out there, waiting for the next group of teenagers who think they're brave enough to prove him wrong. I was 8 years old when my family moved to the end of Copper Ridge Road in eastern Kentucky. My name's Hannah Wells, and I'm 30 now, married with kids of my own, but I still think about that house at the dead end almost every day. We lived there for only 3 months back in 1995, but those 3 months changed everything about how I see the world. My dad, Jim Wells, had just gotten a job delivering mail for the Postal Service, driving those winding mountain routes that most city folks would never attempt. Mom worked checkout at Fletcher's Market down in town, one of those small grocery stores where everybody knows your business. We moved to Copper Ridge because the rent was dirt cheap, and honestly, my parents needed the privacy after some troubles they'd had with money and drinking. The isolation seemed like a blessing back then. Our nearest neighbor was 3 miles down the mountain, and there weren't any streetlights or cell towers, just our little 2-bedroom house and endless dark woods stretching in every direction. The house itself was nothing special, built sometime in the 60s with aluminum siding and a metal roof that pinged whenever it rained. But it was ours, and for a while, it felt like we might actually get a fresh start up there in those quiet mountains. The first week, we lived on Copper Ridge. Everything seemed normal enough. Dad would leave early in the morning for his mail route, driving his little white postal truck down the winding gravel road that connected us to the rest of the world. Mom would take me to school in town, then head to her job at Fletcher's. I remember feeling excited about living in the woods. What 8-year-old wouldn't? I could explore, build forts, maybe even see some deer or black bears from a safe distance. The house had a big yard that backed right up to the forest, and I spent hours those first few days just wandering around, collecting interesting rocks and trying to identify different types of trees. Mom seemed happier than she'd been in months, humming while she unpacked boxes and talking about maybe planting a garden come spring. Dad was relieved to have steady work again, and I could tell he liked the solitude after years of living in cramped apartments where the neighbors could hear every argument through thin walls. For those first few nights, the only sounds we heard were normal mountain noises, owls hooting, the occasional coyote howl in the distance, wind moving through the trees. I fell asleep easily in my new bedroom, lulled by what I thought was the peaceful quiet of country living. But on our 8th night in the house, something changed. I woke up around 2 in the morning to a sound I'd never heard before. Long, deliberate scratching noises coming from directly above my bed. It sounded like fingernails dragging across metal, but slower and more purposeful than any animal I could imagine. The scratches would start at one end of the roof and travel all the way across to the other end, taking maybe 30 seconds to complete the journey. Then silence for a minute or two. Then the same pattern again, always moving from east to west across the metal roofing. I lay there listening for probably an hour, trying to convince myself it was just tree branches scraping in the wind. But there hadn't been any wind that night. The air was perfectly still, and the scratching was too regular, too methodical to be random. When I finally worked up the courage to look out my bedroom window, I couldn't see anything moving in the yard or the tree line. But I had this overwhelming feeling that something was looking back at me from the darkness. The next morning, I told my parents about the scratching sounds. Dad listened with that patient expression he got when he thought I was letting my imagination run wild, but he promised to investigate. After breakfast, he dragged our aluminum extension ladder out of the garage and climbed up to examine the roof. I watched from the yard as he walked around up there, checking for loose branches or signs of animal damage. When he came back down, his face had changed. He called Mom outside and showed us what he'd found. Deep gouges in the metal roofing, running in perfectly parallel lines about 6 inches long. The scratches were too regular and too deliberate to have been made by falling debris or even large animals like raccoons or possums. Could be vandals, Dad said. But I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. Kids from down the mountain, maybe, trying to scare the new family. But even as he said it, none of us really believed it. The scratches were too high up for teenagers to reach without a ladder. And besides that, who would climb onto a stranger's roof in the middle of the night just to scrape up some metal? The scratching continued every single night for the next 2 weeks. Always around 2 a.m., always the same east to west pattern across the roof. It was like whatever was making the noise was following some kind of schedule or ritual that we couldn't understand. Dad tried sitting outside with his hunting rifle a couple of nights, but the scratching would only start after he gave up and came back inside. Mom suggested we call the sheriff, but what would we tell them? That something was walking on our roof at night? They'd think we were crazy, mountain people making up stories. The scratching was bad enough, but what really started to worry me was what I could see from my bedroom window. On the 3rd week, living in the house, I spotted something pale moving between the trees behind our yard. At first glance, it looked almost human, tall and thin, walking upright on 2 legs. But the proportions were all wrong. Its arms hung down too low, nearly reaching the ground, and its head seemed too small for its elongated body. The worst part was how it moved. Its joints bent in directions that human joints shouldn't bend, and it walked with this odd, jerky gait that made my skin crawl just watching it. I told myself I was seeing things, that it was just shadows and moonlight playing tricks on my eyes. But the next night, I saw 3 of them. They moved through the forest in perfect coordination, weaving between the trees like they were following invisible paths. They communicated with each other using soft clicking sounds that carried clearly through the still mountain air. The noises reminded me of the sound beetles make, but louder and more complex, almost like they were speaking some kind of language. Each night, they got a little braver, coming a little closer to our house. By the end of September, I was finding handprints on our windows every morning, smudgy, four-fingered prints with thumbs in the wrong places. The prints were too large to be from children and too strange to be from any animal I knew about. When I showed them to my parents, Mom got that tight look around her eyes that she always got when she was scared but trying not to show it. Hannah's got an overactive imagination. She told Dad that night, but I caught her double-checking all the door locks before bed. She's been watching too many scary movies at her cousin's house. But I could see the fear in both their eyes when they thought I wasn't looking. They'd found the handprints too, and they couldn't explain them away any more than I could. By October, it became clear that these things, whatever they were, hunted in organized groups. They had learned our family's schedule with frightening accuracy. They knew exactly when Dad left for his mail route each morning, and they knew that Mom and I were alone in the house until she drove me to school an hour later. They started showing up during that window of time, testing our windows and doors while we ate breakfast or got ready for the day. I would see their pale faces pressed against the kitchen window while I ate my cereal, tilting their heads at odd angles as they studied my movements. The most disturbing part was when they started trying to mimic human speech. One night in mid-October, I woke up to voices calling my name from outside my bedroom window. "Hannah. Hannah Wells. Come outside. We want to play with you." But the voices were wrong somehow, too breathy and hollow, like air being forced through a broken pipe. They had learned my name, probably from hearing my parents call me, but they couldn't quite get the pronunciation right. My name came out sounding like Hannah, with too much emphasis on the second syllable. I finally got a clear look at one of them through Dad's binoculars on a night when the moon was particularly bright. It was standing at the edge of our yard, just watching our house with that characteristic head tilt they all seemed to do. The creature was about 7 feet tall but emaciated, like it hadn't eaten in months. Its skin was pale gray and stretched tight over prominent bones, giving it an almost skeletal appearance. But the worst part was its eyes. They were enormous, taking up almost half its face, and they were completely black with no visible whites or pupils. When it realized I was watching it through the window, it raised one of its two long arms and waved at me with those wrong-jointed fingers. The gesture was almost friendly, but it made my blood run cold. During this time, Dad started finding evidence in the woods around our house that these things had been feeding nearby. He discovered deer carcasses arranged in neat piles, but they weren't killed by normal predators. The bones had been cracked open and sucked clean of marrow, and they were organized in geometric patterns that no wild animal would create. It was like the creatures were treating our property as their personal hunting ground, and they wanted us to know it. They also started leaving territorial markers to show they had been close to our house. In the mornings, we would find rocks stacked in impossible towers that shouldn't have been able to balance. Trees near our yard had their bark stripped away in perfect spiral patterns that went from the base all the way up to the branches. Our garbage cans, which we left at the end of the driveway for pickup, would be rearranged in geometric shapes, triangles, squares, perfect lines that were clearly intentional. Every night, they systematically tested our defenses. They tried every window, every door, even the chimney. It was like they were conducting experiments, seeing how our house was constructed and looking for the easiest way inside. They learned which windows had the loosest latches and which doors had the weakest locks. Dad started reinforcing everything he could, but it felt like we were preparing for a siege that we couldn't win. Mom finally had her own encounter with them in late October. She got up around 2 a.m. to get a glass of water from the kitchen and found one of them pressed against the window above the sink. It was studying her with its head tilted almost 90 degrees to the side, like it was trying to understand what she was. When she screamed, it vanished instantly, not running away like an animal would, but disappearing as if it had never been there at all. After Mom's encounter, Dad finally took my stories seriously. He set up motion-activated cameras around the perimeter of our property, hoping to get some evidence of what was happening. But the cameras only captured blurry, pale shapes moving impossibly fast between the trees. The creatures seemed to understand what the cameras were for and deliberately avoided triggering them clearly. By November, they stopped trying to hide completely. They would stand in our yard during dinner, 3 or 4 of them at a time, just watching us through the windows while we ate. When we looked directly at them, they would tilt their heads in that unsettling way they all did. But they wouldn't leave. It was like they were studying us, learning our behaviors and reactions. I started having trouble eating because I could feel their black eyes on me through the glass. Then they began playing psychological games with us. They started cutting our electricity at random times, plunging the house into complete darkness. Dad would have to go outside to check the breaker box, and they would watch him from the shadows while he worked. They never approached him directly, but he could see their pale shapes moving at the edge of the flashlight beam. The power outages always happened at the worst possible times. During dinner, while I was doing homework, right as Mom was getting ready for bed. In early November, Dad discovered that his mail truck had been sabotaged. All 4 tires were slashed, and there were long scratches along both sides of the vehicle. The cuts in the tires were too clean to have been accidental damage from rocks or road debris. The creatures were systematically trying to trap us on Copper Ridge, cutting off our connections to the outside world. They wanted us isolated and completely dependent on the house for safety. A few days later, we found that our landline had been severed. The cut was clean and precise, like it had been done with wire cutters or a sharp knife. These things weren't just intelligent animals. They understood human technology well enough to disable it strategically. Without the phone, we couldn't call for help, and without Dad's truck, we couldn't easily get to town for supplies or assistance. The creatures seemed to understand that they were starving us out. They would block the road whenever we tried to drive down the mountain in Mom's car, standing in a perfect line across the pavement like some kind of supernatural roadblock. They wanted us weak and desperate, probably figuring that hungry, frightened people would be easier to catch if we finally gave up and came outside. Dad decided he had to hike through the woods to reach our nearest neighbor's house 3 miles away. It was a risky move because it meant leaving Mom and me alone, but we didn't have any other options. He made the journey during daylight hours, taking his hunting rifle and moving as quickly as he could through the forest. The creatures followed him, but they stayed hidden in the trees, clicking to each other in their strange language. He made it to the neighbor's house and called Sheriff Bradley, who agreed to come up and investigate our situation. But I could tell from Dad's expression when he got back that the sheriff had been skeptical of the story. Sheriff Bradley arrived the next afternoon with 2 deputies. They found all the evidence we'd described: the scratches on the roof, the handprints on the windows, the arranged objects in our yard. But there was no sign of the creatures themselves. They were smart enough to hide when authority figures came around, probably understanding that uniformed officers represented a different kind of threat than our family did. The sheriff suggested we might be dealing with a group of disturbed individuals, maybe drug users or mentally ill people living rough in the mountains. He promised to increase patrols in our area, but I could tell he thought we were overreacting to what was probably just nuisance vandalism. After the officers left, we felt more alone and vulnerable than ever. That night, the night after the sheriff's visit, more of them came than we had ever seen before. Dozens of pale crawlers emerged from the forest and surrounded our house completely. They stood in perfect formation, creating multiple concentric circles around our property. The clicking sounds they made to communicate with each other became a constant chorus that filled the air. It sounded like hundreds of insects, but organized and purposeful in a way that made my skin crawl. For the first time since we'd been living on Copper Ridge, they tried to force their way inside all at once. Windows rattled as they tested every latch simultaneously. The front door shook as they pushed against it in coordinated waves. I could hear them on the roof, not just scratching now, but actually trying to tear through the metal sheeting. The sound was deafening, like being inside a tin can while someone hammered on it from the outside. Dad grabbed his hunting rifle and fired a warning shot through the front door. The blast was incredibly loud in our small house, and for a moment, everything went completely silent. Then I heard them retreating, their clicking voices fading as they moved back toward the tree line. But they didn't go far. We could hear them regrouping in the forest, and somehow we knew they were planning something bigger and more coordinated for the next attempt. Dad made the decision that we had to leave immediately, that very night. We packed only the most essential items: clothes, important documents, what little money we had saved. The creatures watched us through the windows while we prepared to evacuate, and I could tell they understood what we were doing. Their clicking became more agitated, more urgent. They knew we were about to escape their trap. The drive down Copper Ridge Road was the most terrifying experience of my life. As soon as we started the car, they came out of the forest in force. Several of them jumped onto Mom's sedan, scratching at the windows and the roof while Dad floored the accelerator down the mountain. I could see their pale faces pressed against the glass, those enormous black eyes staring at me with what looked almost like disappointment. They kept pace with our car for nearly a mile, running alongside us through the trees with that inhuman speed they possessed. They only gave up the chase when we reached the main highway, where other cars were visible and the forest gave way to more populated areas. We never went back to the house on Copper Ridge Road. Dad requested a transfer to a different postal route, and we moved into a small apartment in town where there were neighbors and streetlights and the comforting sounds of human activity. For months afterward, I had nightmares about those black eyes watching me through windows, and I couldn't sleep unless every curtain in the house was tightly closed. That was 22 years ago now. I'm married to a good man who knows the whole story, and we have 2 children of our own. We live in a suburban neighborhood in Ohio, as far from the mountains as I could manage to get. Sometimes I drive past the turnoff to Copper Ridge Road when we visit my parents for holidays, but I've never been brave enough to go back and see if those creatures are still there. Part of me suspects they are, still waiting in that endless forest, still clicking to each other in their alien language, still looking for the next family foolish enough to seek isolation in those dark Appalachian woods. I've never found any explanation for what we encountered up there. I've read about cryptids and mountain legends, but nothing quite matches what we experienced. Whatever those things were, they were intelligent, organized, and patient in ways that suggested they'd been hunting humans for a very long time. They understood our technology, our schedules, our weaknesses. They knew exactly how to isolate us and break down our defenses systematically. If we hadn't left when we did, I don't think we would have survived much longer. My parents never talk about those 3 months on Copper Ridge, and I don't blame them. Some experiences are too strange and too frightening to discuss, even with family. But every now and then, when I'm putting my own children to bed in their safe suburban rooms, I find myself listening for scratching sounds on our roof. And sometimes, on nights when the moon is bright and the air is still, I swear I can hear clicking noises in the distance, carried on the wind from mountains I left behind decades ago. I'm 31 years old now, working as a forklift operator at a warehouse outside Charleston. But when I was 10, my family lived way up in Sinkhole Valley, West Virginia. My name's Lucas Bennett, and honestly, I've never told anyone the full story about what happened to me down in those caves. People around here know about the sinkholes and underground streams that run all through the limestone, but what lives down there, that's something else entirely. Dad worked the Peabody mine, about 15 miles south of our place, pulling 12-hour shifts underground that left him tired and covered in coal dust every evening. Mom served lunch at Sinkhole Valley Elementary, where she'd worked since before I was born. They were good, hard-working people who trusted me to stay out of trouble during the long summer days when school was out. Our house sat on about 10 acres of mixed forest and open field, with cave entrances scattered all through the woods behind us. Dad had shown me a few of the smaller ones over the years, always warning me about unstable ground and underground streams that could sweep you away if you weren't careful. I'd always been drawn to those dark openings in the earth. There was something about caves that fascinated me. Maybe it was growing up hearing Dad's mining stories, or maybe I just liked the idea of hidden places where nobody else ever went. By the time I was 10, I'd explored maybe a dozen different cave entrances around our property, none of them going deeper than 20 or 30 feet before they either dead-ended or became too narrow to continue. Mom packed me sandwiches and a thermos of sweet tea most mornings, and I'd spend entire days hiking through the woods with my flashlight and a coil of climbing rope Dad had gotten me for my birthday. Sinkhole Valley earned its name honestly. The whole area was riddled with limestone caves and underground waterways that had been carved out over thousands of years. You could be walking along what looked like solid ground and suddenly find yourself staring down into a hole that dropped away into pure darkness. Most of the local families had stories about livestock or hunting dogs that had fallen into hidden sinkholes and never been seen again. The older folks said the underground went on for miles, connecting to cave systems that reached all the way to the Ohio River. But I never put much stock in those kinds of tales. It was late October when I found the new entrance, hidden behind a rockfall that must have happened during the previous winter's freeze-thaw cycle. I'd been following a deer trail I'd never noticed before, about half a mile deeper into the woods than I usually went, when I saw the opening. It was perfectly round, maybe 4 feet across, descending straight down like someone had drilled it with machinery. The strange thing was how warm the air felt coming up from below, even though we'd already had a couple of hard frosts and the leaves were mostly down. I dropped a few rocks to test the depth, counting the seconds until I heard them hit bottom, about 20 feet, which wasn't unusual for the caves around our place. But the air smelled different than other caves I'd been in. Not just the usual damp earth and limestone scent, but something else I couldn't identify. Something organic, almost like the smell of a greenhouse where my mom grew her tomato plants, but warmer and heavier. The descent was easy enough with Dad's rope. I'd gotten pretty good at rappelling into cave entrances over the years, and this one had plenty of handholds carved naturally into the limestone walls. What I found at the bottom, though, was unlike any cave system I'd ever seen. Instead of rough stone walls and uneven floors, this cave opened into a huge natural chamber that had been modified by human hands. The walls showed tool marks where someone had carved steps into the rock face. Passages led off in multiple directions, and some of them had been smoothed and widened far beyond what nature would have created. My flashlight beam couldn't reach the far walls of the main chamber, but I could see evidence of recent work everywhere I looked. Fresh wood chips scattered on the carved stone floor, tool marks that still showed bright white limestone underneath, meaning they couldn't have been made more than a few weeks ago. Someone had been down here recently, doing serious construction work, but who would be digging this far underground without any equipment access from the surface? That's when I first heard the voices, children's voices, echoing from somewhere deeper in the cave system, laughing and talking, playing some kind of game that involved a lot of running around. I figured I'd stumbled onto a group of local kids who'd found their own secret hideout, maybe older kids from the high school who knew about cave systems I'd never discovered. The voices sounded happy and normal, just kids having fun underground where adults couldn't bother them. I followed the sound through a passage that showed even more sophisticated construction work. The floor had been leveled and smoothed, the ceiling carved into a perfect arch that reminded me of pictures I'd seen of old European churches. Whoever had done this work knew what they were doing. It wasn't crude mining or amateur digging. This was skilled stonework that must have taken years to complete. The passage opened into another chamber where the voices were much clearer. I could make out individual words now, kids talking about games and sharing food, discussing who was winning some kind of competition. What struck me as odd was how their voices carried in the space. There was an echo quality that made them sound like they were much further away than they actually were, like the cave system extended much deeper than my flashlight could reach. As I got closer, I started seeing more evidence of permanent habitation. Stone furniture that had been carved directly out of the cave walls. Sleeping areas with what looked like hand-woven blankets made from some kind of plant fiber. A crude but functional kitchen area where someone had carved basins into the limestone and rigged up a system for collecting and storing water from underground streams. This wasn't just a hideout, people were living down here full-time. When I finally found them, 6 kids who looked roughly my age, I knew immediately that something was wrong with their appearance. Their skin was too pale, almost translucent in places, and their eyes seemed too large for their faces. But more than that, the way they moved was different. Too quick and fluid, like they could see perfectly in the darkness, while I needed my flashlight to avoid tripping over the uneven stone floor. They were excited to see me, gathering around and asking questions about the world above, in voices that sounded normal enough, just kids talking. But when they smiled, I could see that their teeth were pointed, filed, or naturally grown into sharp triangular shapes that reminded me of pictures I'd seen of deep-sea fish. And their fingernails weren't quite right either. Too long and too sharp, more like claws than normal human nails. A girl who introduced herself as Penny seemed to be the leader of the group. She explained that they lived down here permanently with their families, that they'd always been here, since before the valley had a name. When I asked where their parents were, she pointed toward passages that led even deeper into the cave system. "They're working on the new chambers," she said. "We're expanding our home to make room for more families." The other children gathered around, touching my clothes and examining my flashlight with curious fingers. They found my surface equipment fascinating but strange, asking why I needed artificial light and whether I always walked so slowly. One boy named Daniel demonstrated how they moved through the caves, scampering up the stone walls and across the ceiling with spider-like agility that made my stomach turn. These weren't normal human children, despite their friendly demeanor and apparent intelligence. They offered to share their lunch with me, pulling out what they called food from woven baskets, raw fish that still had their eyes, various cave fungi, insects that they crunched between their pointed teeth like popcorn, and roots that they assured me were very nutritious. When I pulled out my sandwich and thermos, they examined my food with the same curiosity I was showing toward theirs, commenting that it looked too cooked and wondering why surface people ruined good food with heat. Their games involved hunting in complete darkness, communicating through series of clicks and whistles that sounded more like bat echolocation than human language, and competitions to see who could climb the fastest or catch the most cave fish with their bare hands. They moved through their underground world with absolute confidence, never stumbling or hesitating, while I felt clumsy and slow with my flashlight and normal human limitations. "You should meet our parents," Penny suggested after we'd spent what felt like hours playing their underground games. "They'd love to have you join our family. You could learn to live underground like us and never have to go back to the harsh world above." They led me through passages that went deeper than I'd ever imagined possible, down carved staircases, and through chambers that showed increasingly sophisticated construction. The air got warmer as we descended, and I started noticing a phosphorescent moss growing on the walls that provided a dim but steady light. The hollow dwellers, as I'd started thinking of them, didn't need my flashlight at all in these deeper areas. When we reached the adult gathering area, I understood immediately why the children had seemed so strange. The adults were obviously not human, despite their intelligence and apparent civilization. Their limbs were elongated and thin, their skin so pale it was almost transparent, and their eyes glowed faintly in the darkness like the eyes of nocturnal animals. When they looked at me, I felt like a specimen being examined by scientists. "Fresh blood from above," one of them whispered to another, their voice carrying an accent I couldn't place. "Strong genetics. He'd be a good addition to our community." When I said I needed to go home, that my parents would be worried if I didn't show up for dinner, they explained very politely that surface dwellers who discovered their community couldn't be allowed to leave. "Too dangerous for everyone," the apparent leader said, his voice kind but firm. "You've seen our home now. You're part of the family." They described how they would help me adapt to underground life through a gradual transformation process that would give me the same abilities their children possessed. "It only hurts for the first few weeks," one of the children assured me helpfully. "Then you'll be able to see in the dark and climb walls and catch fish with your hands like we do." That's when they introduced me to other surface children who'd been brought underground over the years. 3 kids who'd once lived in houses like mine, but had been changed by whatever process these creatures used to convert normal humans into hollow dwellers. They were paler and thinner than they should have been, with the same oversized eyes and pointed teeth as the original underground children. But the worst part was that they couldn't remember their surface names or families clearly. The transformation seemed to affect memory and personality along with physical appearance. I tried to leave multiple times over the next few hours, but the passages had been altered since my arrival. Stones had been moved to block routes I'd used before, water had been redirected to flood tunnels, and new walls had been constructed with impossible speed. The hollow dwellers could reshape their underground environment like gardeners rearranging a flower bed, and they used this ability to keep me contained while maintaining their friendly, welcoming demeanor. Even worse, I was starting to experience physical changes just from breathing their underground air and eating small amounts of their food. My night vision was definitely improving. I found I could see much better in the dim phosphorescent light than I should have been able to. But when I looked toward the cave entrance where daylight filtered down, the light hurt my eyes in a way it never had before. The hollow dwellers explained that time moved differently underground, that the surface world was harsh and fast-moving, while their community existed in a more peaceful, slower rhythm. I was starting to believe them. I couldn't tell how long I'd been underground. It felt like it could have been hours or days or even weeks. My sense of time had become completely distorted. I'd lost track of my parents, of dinner time, of whether it was day or night above ground. The hollow dwellers said this was natural, that surface concerns would fade as I adapted to my new life. But somewhere deep in my mind, I still remembered my mom's voice calling me in for meals, and my dad teaching me how to tie knots with his climbing rope. Those memories felt like they were slipping away, but they were still strong enough to motivate me to keep looking for an escape route. That's when I discovered the underground streams. While the hollow dwellers were occupied with their daily activities, working on new chambers, teaching their children hunting techniques, preparing their strange meals, I started following water sounds through abandoned sections of their tunnel system. Cave systems in limestone country always connect to natural underground rivers, and water always finds a way to the surface eventually. I found what I was looking for in a section of cave that had been carved out but then abandoned, probably because the rock was too unstable for permanent habitation. An underground river disappeared through a passage that was barely large enough for a child, much less an adult hollow dweller. The water was moving fast, which meant it was flowing downhill toward an exit somewhere. I pretended to accept my situation for the next day or two, participating in their games and meals while secretly planning my escape. The hollow dwellers became less watchful once they thought I'd given up on returning to the surface, and they started leaving me alone for longer periods while they worked on expanding their underground community. When the opportunity came, I took it. The passage where the underground river disappeared was terrifying. A narrow tube barely wide enough for my body, filled with fast-moving water that could sweep me away or drown me if I lost my grip on the slippery limestone walls. But it was my only chance to escape before their transformation process made me forget why I wanted to leave. I had to hold my breath and swim through complete darkness, feeling my way along the walls of an underwater tunnel that seemed to go on forever. The current was strong enough to help push me along, but also strong enough to slam me into rock walls if I didn't position myself correctly. Several times I thought I was going to drown, but somehow the passage kept going, always angling upward toward what I hoped was the surface. When I finally emerged from a spring nearly 5 miles from where I'd entered the original cave, it was full, dark above ground. I'd lost my flashlight somewhere in the underground river, but the moonlight seemed incredibly bright after the soft phosphorescence of the hollow dweller caves. It took me hours to hike back through woods I barely recognized, following streams and ridgelines until I found landmarks I knew. I got home to find police cars in our driveway and search teams getting ready to comb the woods with dogs. My parents were frantic. Apparently I'd been missing for 3 days, though it had felt like much longer underground. I told them I'd gotten lost in a cave system and had to find an alternate route to the surface, which was true enough without going into details about the hollow dwellers. The experience left me with changes that lasted for years. My night vision stayed enhanced long after I should have returned to normal, and I developed an aversion to enclosed spaces that made it impossible for me to follow Dad into mining work like he'd hoped. But more than that, I never went back into the caves around Sinkhole Valley. Even now, 21 years later, I won't go underground for any reason. Sometimes I wonder about those hollow dweller children, whether they're still down there, expanding their community and looking for new surface dwellers to join their family. I never reported what I found. Who would have believed me? But I've always felt guilty about leaving them free to take other kids who might not be as lucky as I was. To this day, I still wake up sometimes with the taste of that warm, humid cave air in my mouth and the memory of pointed teeth smiling at me in the darkness. I was 14 that summer when everything went to hell, working my first real job for Mr. Jenkins on his tobacco farm outside of Mason County, West Virginia. My name's Tyler Hayes, and honestly, I just wanted to make enough money to buy a beat-up Honda Civic from the lot in town. Nothing fancy, just something that would get me around without having to ask my parents for rides everywhere. Dad's a carpenter, built half the houses in our little town over the past 20 years. Mom works at First National Bank downtown, handling loans and mortgages for folks trying to buy the houses Dad builds. They're good people, salt-of-the-earth types who believed in teaching work ethic early. When I told them I wanted a car, Dad just nodded and said, "Then you better find a way to pay for it." That's how I ended up knocking on Mr. Jenkins' door in early June, asking if he needed help with the tobacco harvest. Mr. Jenkins was probably in his 70s then, a wiry old man with hands like tree bark and eyes that seemed to see right through you. His farm was the biggest tobacco operation in the county, over 300 acres of prime growing land stretching back into the hills. He had 12 curing barns scattered across his property, massive wooden structures where the harvested leaves would hang and dry for weeks. The pay was decent for a kid my age, and the work wasn't too complicated. Mostly helping with the harvest, loading trucks, basic maintenance around the farm. Looking back now, I should have paid more attention to the way Mr. Jenkins introduced me to the property. He walked me around, showing me the fields, the equipment, the storage areas. We passed all 12 barns, but when we got to the one furthest from the farmhouse, an old weathered structure that looked like it had been standing since the 1920 seconds, he stopped and turned to face me directly. "Tyler," he said, his voice carrying a weight I didn't understand at the time, "I want you to listen to me carefully. You see barn 12 here? This old one? You stay out of it, period. It's got structural problems, roof leaks, floors rotted through in places. Dangerous for someone your age to go poking around in there." I nodded, figuring it made sense. The barn did look rough compared to the others. Paint peeling, a few loose boards, heavy chain and padlock on the door. Mr. Jenkins was just being careful, didn't want a lawsuit if I fell through some rotten floorboards. Made perfect sense to my 14-year-old brain. The first few weeks went smooth as could be. I'd show up every morning at 7, work until lunch, take an hour break, then finish up around 4 in the afternoon. The other workers were mostly older guys who'd been doing this for years, and they treated me decent enough. Taught me how to handle the tobacco leaves without damaging them, how to string them up properly in the curing barns, how to read the weather signs that told you when it was time to harvest a particular field. Mr. Jenkins' farm felt like stepping back in time. He still used a lot of the old methods his grandfather had taught him, hanging tobacco in wooden barns instead of using the newer bulk curing systems, timing the harvest by feel and experience rather than moisture meters. The work was hard, especially in the July heat, but there was something satisfying about it. Something real. It was during the third week that my curiosity got the better of me. I was eating lunch under a big oak tree between barns 11 and 12, same spot I'd been eating every day. The other workers usually went back to the farmhouse or sat in their trucks with the AC running, but I liked the quiet out there. That day, though, the quiet felt different somehow. Heavier. Like the air itself was holding its breath. I kept glancing over at barn 12, trying to figure out what was bothering me about it. Then it hit me. Despite what Mr. Jenkins had said about structural problems and danger, the barn didn't look empty. Through the gaps in the weathered boards, I could see hanging tobacco leaves, rows and rows of them, just like in all the other barns. Now, I wasn't stupid. I knew Mr. Jenkins had his reasons for telling me to stay away, and I respected the man. But I also couldn't shake the feeling that he was hiding something from me. Maybe it was just natural teenage rebellion, or maybe something deeper was pulling me toward that barn. But I made up my mind to take a quick look. The chain on the door was old but solid, the padlock newer than the rest of the hardware. I walked around the entire barn, looking for another way in, and found what I was looking for on the back side. A board that had warped away from the frame, leaving a gap just wide enough for a skinny 14-year-old to squeeze through. The moment I slipped inside barn 12, I knew something was terribly wrong. The smell hit me first. Not the earthy, sweet aroma of curing tobacco, but something else. Something rotten and organic, like compost, that had been left too long in the rain. The air felt thick, almost oily, and I had to breathe through my mouth to keep from gagging. The tobacco hanging in there wasn't like anything I'd seen in the other barns. These leaves were wrong, completely black instead of the golden brown of properly cured tobacco, and covered in what looked like fuzzy gray mold. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that the mold seemed to pulse, like it was breathing, like it was alive. I should have turned around and left right then. Should have squeezed back through that gap and never mentioned what I'd seen to anyone. But I was 14 and curious, and something about the way those leaves moved in the still air kept me rooted to the spot. That's when I took my first real breath inside the barn. The moment I inhaled, I sucked in what felt like a cloud of black dust. Spores, I realized later, though at the time I just thought it was particles from the old wood and moldy tobacco. I started coughing immediately. Deep, harsh coughs that made my chest burn. But I figured it was just the dusty air. Nothing a few minutes in the fresh air couldn't cure. I was wrong about that, dead wrong. By the time I got home that evening, the cough had settled into my chest like it planned to stay. Mom noticed it first, the way mothers always do. "Tyler, honey, "You sound terrible," she said over dinner, reaching across the table to feel my forehead. "You running a fever?" "Nah, I'm fine," I told her, though my voice came out rougher than I expected. "Just dusty at the farm today, probably allergies or something." Dad looked up from his meatloaf, studying my face with those carpenter's eyes that could spot a problem from across a room. "You sure? Your mom's right, you don't sound good." I waved them off, not wanting to admit I'd been somewhere I wasn't supposed to be. "Really, I'm fine, just need some water." But I wasn't fine. Over the next few days, the cough got progressively worse, and I started noticing other things. My spit had turned dark, almost black, and there was a constant metallic taste in my mouth that no amount of brushing my teeth could get rid of. Breathing became more difficult, especially when I was lying down at night. I'd find myself propped up on extra pillows, gasping for air like an old man with emphysema. The worst part was that I could feel something moving in my chest. Not just the normal sensation of breathing, but something else. Something that felt like it was growing, spreading, taking root in places it didn't belong. By Friday of that week, I couldn't hide it anymore. I was working in Barn 6, helping to hang a fresh load of tobacco, when a coughing fit hit me so hard I doubled over and couldn't stop. When I finally caught my breath and looked up, Mr. Jenkins was standing in the doorway, his face white as a sheet. "You went into Barn 12, didn't you?" he said. And it wasn't really a question. I wanted to lie, wanted to deny it, but something in his expression stopped me. I nodded, feeling like a kid who'd been caught stealing from the cookie jar. Mr. Jenkins walked over to a hay bale and sat down hard, putting his head in his hands. For a long moment, the only sound was the distant buzz of insects outside, and my own labored breathing. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, so quiet I almost didn't hear him. "Jesus Christ. Not again." "Mr. Jenkins? What do you mean, not again?" He looked up at me with eyes full of guilt and fear. "Tyler, son, I need you to listen to me very carefully. That tobacco in Barn 12, it's not just old or moldy, it's infected with something. Something that killed 3 of my grandfather's workers back in the 1940s. The bottom dropped out of my stomach. "What are you talking about?" "It's a fungus," he said, his voice getting steadier as he talked, like he was relieved to finally be telling someone. "My grandfather never figured out exactly what it was, but it grows on tobacco under certain conditions. Spreads through spores in the air. Once you breathe it in." He gestured helplessly at my deteriorating condition. "So get me to a doctor," I said, panic starting to creep into my voice. "There's got to be medicine for it, antibiotics or something." "Mr. Jenkins shook his head slowly. "My grandfather tried everything. Took those 3 men to every doctor between here and Charleston. Nobody had ever seen anything like it. They all died within a month." I felt the world tilt around me. "Then why did you keep it? Why didn't you burn it or something?" "I tried," he said. "Lord knows I tried. But every time I went to destroy it, something stopped me. Like the barn itself didn't want to let go of what was inside. And I needed the storage space, told myself I could just keep it locked up, keep people away from it." He looked at me with tears in his eyes. "I'm sorry, Tyler. I'm so damn sorry." That weekend, Mom and Dad took me to see Dr. Patterson, our family physician who'd been treating people in Mason County for over 30 years. He took one look at my symptoms, listened to my chest with his stethoscope, and ordered immediate chest x-rays. What those x-rays showed changed everything. "I've never seen anything like this, Doctor," Patterson said, clipping the films to the light box in his office. "Look at these dark patches spreading through your lungs. It looks almost like tree branches, or veins, and they're growing." He showed us x-rays from my last physical 6 months earlier for comparison. The difference was horrifying. Where my lungs had been clear and healthy before, now they were shot through with black lines that seemed to pulse and twist on the film. "What is it?" Mom asked, gripping Dad's hand so tight her knuckles were white. "I honestly don't know, Doctor," Patterson admitted. "I'm going to need to do some research, make some calls. In the meantime, Tyler, I want you to rest as much as possible. Don't exert yourself, and call me immediately if your breathing gets any worse." Over the next few days, while Dr. Patterson made calls to specialists and searched medical databases, my condition continued to deteriorate. The metallic taste in my mouth got stronger, and I started noticing changes in my fingernails. They were turning black and becoming thick and hard. almost like claws. The skin around my nose and mouth took on a grayish color that makeup couldn't hide, and I could taste metal constantly, like I was sucking on pennies. But the worst part was what was happening to my mind. I started having hallucinations. Vivid, terrifying visions of tobacco plants growing inside our house, their black leaves unfurling from the walls and ceiling. I could hear them whispering to me in voices that sounded almost human, urging me to come back to Barn 12, to breathe in more of the spores, to join them completely. The breathing got so bad that I couldn't lie flat anymore. Had to sleep sitting up in my dad's recliner, gasping for air like a fish out of water. Even short walks to the bathroom left me exhausted and wheezing. Mom and Dad were beside themselves. I could see the fear in their eyes every time they looked at me, watch them whispering in the kitchen when they thought I couldn't hear. Dad had taken time off work, something he never did, and Mom had used up all her vacation days to stay home and watch over me. Dr. Patterson finally found something in the old medical archives that made sense of what was happening to me. There had been a case in the 1942nd, 3 farm workers who died from a mysterious fungal infection after working with contaminated tobacco. The symptoms matched mine exactly: the black spit, the metallic taste, the changes to fingernails and skin, the progressive respiratory failure. But there was one detail in those old files that gave us hope. A woman named Rose Caldwell who had been infected but survived. Rose was still alive, though just barely. She was 87 years old and living in a nursing home in Huntington, about an hour's drive from our house. When Dr. Patterson called and explained the situation, she agreed to see me right away. I've been waiting 60 years for someone else to get infected. She told us when we arrived at the nursing home. Knew it would happen eventually. That stuff doesn't just die off on its own. Rose was tiny, probably didn't weigh more than 90 pounds, but her eyes were sharp and focused. She studied my face, had me breathe on her hand so she could smell my breath, examined my fingernails with the intensity of a scientist. "Yep," she said finally, "you got it, all right. Same thing that nearly killed me in 1943. But you survived," Mom said, hope creeping into her voice for the first time in days. "There's a cure?" Rose laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Cure? I suppose you could call it that. More like controlled dying, if you ask me. The treatment that saved me nearly killed me 3 times over, and it only worked because I had help from someone who understood mountain medicine." She explained that the fungus could be killed, but the treatment was almost as dangerous as the infection itself. It required lowering the body temperature to near-death levels while flooding the system with compounds extracted from specific mountain plants that had natural antifungal properties. The process was essentially controlled hypothermia combined with an herbal cocktail that was toxic in its own right. "The hospital won't do it," Rose warned us. "Too dangerous, too experimental. But I can walk you through it, if you've got the stomach for it. Your boy's got maybe a week before the fungus reaches his heart. After that, there ain't no saving him." Mom and Dad looked at each other for a long moment, having one of those wordless conversations that only people married for 20 years can have. Finally, Dad spoke. "What do we need to do?" The next 3 days were a blur of preparation. Dad used his construction contacts to help us set up a makeshift medical facility in our basement. Clean room, temperature controls, monitoring equipment borrowed from friends who worked at the local hospital. Dr. Patterson, bless him, risked his medical license to help us, bringing IV equipment and medications that would be needed for the procedure. Rose, despite her age, insisted on overseeing every detail. She had us gather specific plants from the mountains: wild ginseng, witch hazel, something she called devil's walking stick that grew in old-growth forest. She supervised as we prepared the herbal extracts, timing everything down to the minute. The treatment itself was scheduled for a Tuesday night, when we'd have the most privacy and the least chance of interference. By then, I was barely conscious most of the time, my breathing so labored that every breath was a struggle. They laid me out on a makeshift table in the basement, surrounded by ice packs and monitoring equipment. Dr. Patterson inserted an IV line and began the process of lowering my body temperature while Rose prepared the plant extracts. "This is going to be rough," Rose told my parents as they worked. "For about 12 hours, your boy's going to be technically dead. No heartbeat, no breathing, body temperature down around 80 degrees. But that's the only way to kill the fungus without killing him. I remember the cold hitting me like a physical blow, starting at my core and spreading outward until every cell in my body felt like it was crystallizing. The last thing I saw before everything went black was my parents' faces, twisted with fear and determination. For 12 hours, I was gone, completely gone. No heartbeat, no brain activity, body temperature so low that I should have died from hypothermia alone. But somehow, Dr. Patterson and Rose kept me viable, working frantically to maintain the delicate balance between killing the fungus and keeping my body functional enough to restart when it was over. When I finally came back, and I mean that literally, like returning from someplace far away, the first thing I noticed was that I could breathe again. Really breathe, without that crushing weight in my chest. The X-rays Dr. Patterson took the next day showed the black patches in my lungs dissolving like smoke, my respiratory system slowly returning to normal function. The recovery took weeks. I had to relearn how to breathe properly, rebuild lung capacity that had been destroyed by the infection, restore normal circulation to my extremities. But there were also unexpected changes. Gifts, Rose called them, though I'm not sure I'd use that word. My sense of smell had become incredibly acute, especially when it came to detecting plant diseases. I could walk past a garden and immediately identify any fungal infections, bacterial blights, or viral problems affecting the plants. Dr. Patterson said the fungus had somehow rewired part of my nervous system, leaving me with an ability that was both useful and disturbing. Once I was well enough to get around, one of the first things we did was deal with Barn 12. Mr. Jenkins' dad and about a dozen other men from the community gathered on a Saturday morning with gasoline and matches. They burned that barn to the ground, making sure every trace of infected tobacco was destroyed. The fire burned so hot it melted the metal hardware and turned the concrete foundation black. Mr. Jenkins never quite forgave himself for what happened to me, even though I told him repeatedly that it wasn't his fault. He paid for all my medical expenses and helped set up a college fund that would later pay for my education. But more than that, he became like a second father to me, teaching me everything he knew about agriculture and plant diseases. Rose Caldwell died peacefully 2 weeks after my recovery. In her sleep at the nursing home, the nurses said she went with a smile on her face, like she'd finally been able to let go of some burden she'd been carrying for decades. The experience changed the entire direction of my life. I went on to study agricultural science and plant pathology at West Virginia University, using my enhanced diagnostic abilities to excel in ways that amazed my professors. They couldn't understand how I could identify diseases by smell alone, sometimes detecting problems weeks before they became visible. Today, I work as a plant pathologist for the state agriculture department. My job is to help farmers identify and treat crop diseases before they become dangerous to people, animals, or other plants. Part of my responsibility involves monitoring old tobacco farms throughout the region for signs of the same fungus that nearly killed me. Over the years, I've found and safely destroyed 3 other infected barns, always working with hazmat protocols and complete protective equipment. Each time, I've wondered how many other people might have been exposed, how many others might have died from infections that were never properly diagnosed. Dad helped me convert our old barn into a research laboratory where I can study plant diseases in a controlled environment. Mom handles the administrative side of my work, managing the paperwork and coordinating with other state agencies. What started as a family crisis became a family mission, protecting people from the kinds of agricultural dangers that most folks never even know exist. I still live in Mason County, about 10 miles from where Mr. Jenkins' farm used to be. The land was sold after he passed away 5 years ago, converted into a housing development where young families are raising children who will never know what used to grow in the soil beneath their swing sets. Sometimes, on quiet summer evenings when the air is still and heavy, I catch a whiff of something that reminds me of that day in Barn 12. It makes my enhanced sense of smell react in ways that bring back every detail of those terrible weeks. The taste of metal, the weight in my chest, the whispered voices of infected plants calling me back to join them. But I'm not afraid anymore. I understand now that some knowledge comes with a price, and some experiences change you in ways that can't be undone. The fungus took something from me that summer when I was 14, but it also gave me something back. The ability to protect others from the same fate, and the knowledge that sometimes the most dangerous things are hidden in the most ordinary places. I never did get that Honda Civic I was saving for. By the time I was healthy enough to drive again, cars seemed a lot less important than they had before. Funny how nearly dying puts things in perspective like that. Back when I was 13, my family held a reunion at this old abandoned church in West Virginia called Blackstone. I'm 31 now, and I still wake up some nights hearing those voices. My name's Michael Rodriguez, and I need to tell someone about what happened, because I can't carry this alone anymore. Dad worked the lumber mill back then. Mom was secretary at the high school. Normal family, normal life, until that weekend in October when everything went to hell. We'd been planning this reunion for months, 40-something relatives gathering to clean up the old church where our great-great-grandparents got married in 1889. The building had been abandoned since the 60s, but our family still owned it, still felt responsible for it. Blackstone Church sits in this little valley about 2 hours into the mountains from Charleston. Blackstone Creek runs behind it, and the whole area feels cut off from civilization. No cell service, no radio stations, just trees and rocks and that constant sound of water running over stones. The church itself is built from local stone, with these tall windows that were mostly boarded up and a bell tower that looked ready to collapse. I remember thinking it felt wrong the moment I stepped out of our truck, not just old or abandoned. Wrong. Like the air was thicker than it should be, like something was pressing down on the whole valley. Dad just handed me a broom and told me to sweep out the sanctuary while the adults worked on repairs. The inside was worse than the outside. Dust everywhere, spider webs hanging like curtains, and this smell I couldn't place. Not decay exactly, more like wet wool? Or maybe like when you leave clothes in the washer too long. The wooden pews were still there, arranged in neat rows facing an altar that looked like it had been carved from the same stone as the walls. What really got my attention, though, were the dust patterns on the floor. Instead of being scattered randomly, the dust had settled in these perfect spiral shapes around specific spots. 43 spirals, I counted later. Each one about the size of a person lying down. I started sweeping from the back, working my way toward the altar. That's when I heard the first voice. "Help me." Just 2 words, whispered so quietly I almost missed them. I stopped and listened, but there was nothing except the sound of my cousin Danny working in the next room and my uncle hammering something on the roof. "Hello?" I called out, feeling stupid even as I did it. Nothing. I kept sweeping, telling myself it was just the wind or maybe sound carrying from outside. But about 10 minutes later, I heard it again. "Please help me." This time it was clearer. Definitely a woman's voice, and it sounded like it was coming from right behind me. I spun around, but the sanctuary was empty. Just rows of dusty pews and afternoon light filtering through cracks in the boarded windows. "Danny," I called out. "You hearing anything weird in there?" "Like what?" he called back. "Like voices?" He poked his head through the doorway, broom in hand. "What kind of voices?" "Someone saying, 'Help me.'" Danny looked around the empty sanctuary, then back at me with this expression, like he was trying to figure out if I was messing with him. "Dude, there's nobody here but us. You sure you're not just hearing things?" I wanted to believe that's all it was, but something in my gut told me otherwise. The voice had been too clear, too desperate, and there was something else, a feeling like I was being watched, like dozens of eyes were tracking my every movement, even though I couldn't see anyone. I went back to sweeping, but now I was listening for every sound. The old building creaked and settled, wind whistled through gaps in the walls, and underneath it all was that constant babble of the creek outside. Normal sounds, nothing to be worried about. Then I heard the crying. It started soft, just sniffling and quiet sobs coming from somewhere near the front of the church. But as I kept working, more voices joined in. Men crying, children wailing, women making these horrible keening sounds like they were mourning the dead. The noise built and built until it filled the entire sanctuary, echoing off the stone walls and making my teeth ache. I dropped the broom and ran for the door, but when I got outside, the crying stopped immediately. Just like that, total silence except for the creak and my heart hammering in my chest. "You okay, kiddo?" Uncle Robert was up on a ladder working on one of the windows. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Yeah, I'm fine, just needed some air." But I wasn't fine. The silence outside was almost worse than the crying inside, because it meant whatever I'd heard was contained within those stone walls. and I had to go back in there. I stood outside for maybe 5 minutes, trying to work up the courage to return to the sanctuary. The other adults were scattered around the building, working on their various projects, chatting and laughing like this was just a normal family workday. Nobody else seemed to notice anything unusual. When I finally went back inside, the voices started up again immediately. Not crying this time, but talking. Dozens of people having conversations in whispers so quiet I couldn't make out individual words, just the constant murmur of human voices discussing something urgent and frightening. I tried to focus on my sweeping, tried to ignore the sounds, but they kept getting louder and more distinct. People arguing about something, pleading with someone, making plans that sounded desperate and panicked. And underneath it all, that same woman's voice I'd heard first, repeating, help me, over and over like a broken record. By the time we broke for lunch, I was a nervous wreck. My hands were shaking, I couldn't eat, and I kept jumping every time someone spoke to me. Mom asked if I was feeling sick. But how do you explain to your mother that you're hearing the voices of dead people? After lunch, I convinced Danny to work in the sanctuary with me. I figured if there was someone else there, maybe the voices would leave me alone, or maybe he'd hear them too, and I'd know I wasn't losing my mind. We worked together for about an hour, Danny chattering away about school and video games while I listened for any sign of the voices. For a while, it seemed like they were gone. Just normal sounds, our brooms on the wooden floor, conversation from the other adults, birds outside. Then Danny stopped talking mid-sentence. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. "Hear what?" Sounded like someone calling my name. We both stood perfectly still, listening. After a moment, it came again, a child's voice, maybe 8 or 9 years old, calling, "Danny, Danny," from somewhere in the front of the church. "That's not possible," Danny said, but his face had gone white. "There's no kids here except us." "Danny," the voice called again, more urgent this time. "Come help me, I'm stuck." Without thinking, Danny started walking toward the altar, following the sound. I grabbed his arm. "Don't," I said. "Something's wrong here. But what if it's a real kid? What if someone's trapped or hurt?" The voice called out again, and this time I could hear the fear in it. "Danny, please. It's dark and I can't get out." Danny pulled away from me and kept walking toward the front of the church, calling back, "Where are you? I'm coming." That's when things got really bad. More voices started up. Men shouting orders, women screaming, children crying in terror. The sounds bounced off the stone walls and amplified, until it was like being inside a tornado of human suffering. Danny stopped in his tracks, hands over his ears, his mouth open in a silent scream. And then I saw them. They appeared all at once, like someone had suddenly turned on a light. Dozens of people in old-fashioned clothes, standing in the aisles and crowded around the altar, but they weren't solid. I could see through them to the stone walls behind, and they were all soaking wet, water streaming from their hair and clothes and pooling on the floor beneath their feet. Their faces were the worst part, twisted with panic and terror, mouths open like they were screaming or gasping for air that wouldn't come. Their eyes were wide with the kind of fear you see in animals caught in traps, desperate and hopeless, and completely aware that they're going to die. They were looking at us, all of them, turning to stare at me and Danny with expressions of hunger so intense it made my skin crawl. They wanted something from us, needed something, and whatever it was, I knew with absolute certainty that giving it to them would be the worst mistake of our lives. "Danny," I shouted over the noise, "we have to get out of here now." But Danny couldn't hear me. He was standing frozen in place, staring at one of the ghost children who was beckoning to him with a pale, waterlogged hand. The child's mouth was moving, saying something I couldn't hear over the chaos. But whatever it was, Danny was listening. I ran over and physically grabbed Danny, shaking him until he blinked and seemed to see me again. "We're leaving," I yelled, and half-dragged him toward the door. The ghosts didn't like that. They swarmed toward us, still transparent but somehow more solid than before, their wet footsteps squelching on the wooden floor. The noise of their voices rose to a crescendo that felt like it might burst my eardrums. We made it to the door just as one of the ghosts, a man in a dark suit with water streaming from his mouth, reached out to grab Danny's shoulder. His fingers passed right through Danny's shirt, but I swear I felt a blast of cold air that carried the smell of stagnant water and something worse. Something rotten. Outside, Danny collapsed on the grass, gasping and shaking, Inside the church, the noise continued for another minute or so, then gradually faded to nothing. "What the hell was that?" Danny whispered. "I don't know," I said. Though I was starting to have a terrible suspicion, I found Great Aunt Martha sitting on a folding chair in the shade, working on some kind of needlework. Martha was the family historian, the one who knew all the old stories and remembered things that happened before most of us were born. "Martha," I said, sitting down beside her, "what do you know about this church, about what happened here?" She looked up at me with sharp eyes that seemed to see more than they should. "Why do you ask, honey?" "Because Danny and I just saw something inside. Ghosts, I think. Lots of them, all wet, all looking terrified." Martha's face went very serious. She set down her needlework and studied me for a long moment. "How many of them?" she asked finally. "I don't know. Dozens, maybe 40 or 50. She nodded slowly. "That would be about right." "About right for what?" "For the number of people who drowned in there during the flood of 1958. My blood went cold. "People drowned in the church?" "Worst storm these mountains ever seen," Martha said quietly. "Blackstone Creek rose 20 feet in less than an hour. The whole congregation was in there for Sunday service when the water hit. Building filled up like a bathtub, and nobody could get the doors open against the pressure. But they're still here. They're still trapped." "Some places hold on to death," Martha said, "especially when it's violent and sudden and happens to a lot of people at once. They get confused, these souls. They don't understand they're dead, so they can't move on." "Can't we help them?" Martha's expression darkened. "Child, you don't want to help them. What you saw in there, that's not just ghosts. That's something else, something hungry." "What do you mean?" 43 people died in that church, but their bodies weren't found for 3 days. By then, they'd been underwater long enough for changes to happen, physical changes and spiritual ones. They're not just the dead, honey, they're the drowned dead, and that's a different thing entirely. "I don't understand. The drowned dead don't rest easy. The water gets into them, body and soul, and changes them. Makes them want things they shouldn't want, need things they can't have. They look at living people and see what they've lost, and they want it back." "You mean they want to hurt us?" "I mean they want to trade places with you. And if you stay in that church long enough, if you listen to their voices and look into their eyes and feel sorry for them the way your tender heart wants to, they'll figure out how to make that trade." The rest of the family was packing up to leave. The day's work was done, and we were planning to come back the next morning for the actual reunion service. But I couldn't stop thinking about what Martha had told me, and about the way those ghost children had been looking at Danny. That night, I dreamed about drowning. I was in the church, but it was full of black water that tasted like mud and death. The water was rising, and I couldn't find the doors, and all around me were the voices of the drowned dead calling my name, begging me to help them, promising they would show me the way out if I would just come closer, just listen to what they had to say. I woke up gasping, my pajamas soaked with sweat that smelled like creek water. The next morning, Danny wasn't himself. He was quiet and distant, and when I asked him about the ghosts, he claimed he didn't remember seeing anything unusual. "You must have imagined it," he said, but his eyes had a strange flat look that made my skin crawl. "There's nothing wrong with that church. It's a peaceful place. We should spend more time there." I grabbed his arm. "Danny, what did they say to you? What did that ghost kid tell you?" For just a moment, his face went completely blank, and when he spoke, it wasn't in his voice. It was the voice of that drowned child, speaking through Danny's mouth. "He said he's lonely. He said he wants to play with me forever. He said, if I come back to the water, we can be best friends and never be apart." Then Danny blinked, and his normal expression returned. "What?" "Sorry, I was thinking about something else. What did you ask me?" "I didn't tell my parents what was happening. How could I?" But when the family gathered at the church for the reunion service that Sunday morning, I refused to go inside. I made up some excuse about feeling sick and sat in the truck while the rest of them went in for what they planned to be a nice, peaceful memorial service. It wasn't peaceful. 20 minutes after they went inside, I heard the screaming start. Not ghosts screaming this time. Living people screaming in absolute terror. The sound poured out of that stone building like water from a broken dam, and I could hear individual voices I recognized. My mother shrieking, Uncle Robert calling for God, children crying. I ran to the church doors, but they wouldn't open. They were locked or stuck or held shut by something I couldn't see. I pounded on them and yelled for someone to let me in, but the screaming just got louder. Through cracks in the boarded windows, I could see glimpses of what was happening inside. The air was full of water, not flooding in from outside, but water that seemed to be pouring down from the ceiling and seeping up from the floor. My family members were thrashing around in it, trying to reach the doors, but every time they got close, something pulled them back. The drowned dead were everywhere, more solid now than they'd been before. They moved through the water like they owned it, grabbing at my living relatives with hands that left muddy fingerprints on their clothes and skin. And they were trying to switch places. I could see it happening, the ghosts attempting to climb inside my family members like they were putting on new clothes. Some of them were succeeding. I watched my cousin Sarah stop struggling and go limp in the water, her eyes rolling back until only the whites showed. When she opened them again, something else was looking out, something that had been dead for 60 years. The screaming continued for maybe 10 more minutes, then gradually faded to silence. The water drained away as quickly as it had appeared, leaving my family members lying motionless on the wet wooden floor. The church doors swung open. One by one, my relatives started getting up and walking outside. They looked normal at first glance, but something was wrong with the way they moved. Too fluid, like they were swimming through air instead of walking. And their eyes had that same flat, dead look Danny had shown the day before. "Michael," my mother said, but it wasn't my mother's voice coming out of her mouth. "Come inside, honey. It's time for the service." "Where's Dad?" I asked. "He's inside, waiting for you." We're all waiting. Behind her, more of my family emerged from the church. Uncle Robert, with water dripping from his mouth. Great Aunt Martha, moving with the jerky motions of a marionette. Danny grinning at me with an expression that belonged on someone much older and much deader. "Come inside," they all said in unison. "Join us. The water is warm." I ran back to our truck and somehow got it started, even though I was only 13 and had never driven anything bigger than a riding mower. I drove that truck like my life depended on it, tearing down the mountain road, while behind me, the entire congregation of replaced family members poured out of Blackstone Church and watched me go with dead, patient eyes. I made it to the highway before the truck ran out of gas. A state trooper found me there 6 hours later, sitting on the side of the road and shaking so hard I could barely speak. He said he'd check on my family, but when he came back, his report was that he'd found the church empty, except for some puddles on the floor. No sign of the 40 people who had gone in for the memorial service. No evidence of foul play. Just an abandoned building that smelled like stagnant water. The official story is that my family died in a flash flood. Blackstone Creek rose without warning, they said, and swept everyone away before they could escape. Tragic accident. Bodies were never recovered due to the rough terrain and fast-moving water. But I know the truth. They didn't drown. They were replaced. 43 living people for 43 dead ones. A trade that the drowned spirits had been waiting 60 years to make. The worst part is that they're still out there. The things wearing my family's faces. I see them sometimes, in grocery stores or at gas stations, always near water. They've learned to act more human over the years, but I can still recognize them by their eyes and the way they move. Like they're swimming instead of walking. They don't age, of course. My mother still looks exactly like she did that day 18 years ago. Danny is eternally 13, though the thing inside him has learned to dress and speak like the teenager he should have been. Sometimes they try to talk to me. They call my name from across parking lots or wave at me through restaurant windows. They want me to come closer, to listen to what they have to say, to let them explain how much better things would be if I just accepted what happened and joined them. I never do. I've moved 6 times in 18 years, always staying near running water because I've learned that's the only thing that gives me any warning when they're close. Rivers, streams, even fountain pens. Anything that makes the sound of flowing water seems to interfere with whatever holds them together. I don't have a family anymore. Can't risk it. Can't bring children into a world where the dead can steal the living and wear their faces like masks. Can't build relationships with people I might have to watch get replaced by hungry ghosts who've had 60 years to perfect their mimicry. The church is still there, far as I know. Probably still waiting for the next family reunion, the next group of warm bodies foolish enough to think they can honor the dead without becoming them. And somewhere out there, 43 people who used to be my relatives are living lives they stole from the bottom of a flooded church, getting better every day at pretending to be human. I'm 31 now, and I've never told this story before because I know how it sounds. But I can't keep it to myself anymore. The dreams are getting worse, and I'm starting to hear that voice again, the woman from the church, whispering, "Help me," in moments when the world gets too quiet. I think they're calling me home. And God help me, part of me wants to answer. I was 7 years old when I learned that some hungers can't be satisfied, and some holes in the ground should never be explored. My name's Bobby Miller, and I'm 25 now, married with 2 kids of my own. We still live on the same family farm outside Beckley, West Virginia, though I've built my house on the opposite side of the property from where I grew up. There's a good reason for that, and it's not one I talk about much. Back then, life was pretty simple for a kid in our part of the mountains. Dad drove school buses for McDowell County, getting up before dawn every day to pick up kids scattered across the hollers. Mom waitressed at Murphy's Diner in town, working the breakfast and lunch shifts to be home when Dad got back in the evening. We had 20 acres of pasture and woods, a small farmhouse that Dad's grandfather had built, and about 30 chickens that helped us make ends meet. Money was always tight, but we got by. I was the curious one in the family. My little sister Emma, who was only 4 at the time, preferred to stick close to Mom, helping with cooking and playing with her dolls on the front porch. But me? I loved exploring every inch of our property. I knew where the old stone walls marked the original boundaries, where the creek ran fastest after spring rains, and which trees had the best branches for climbing. Dad used to joke that I was part bloodhound, always sniffing around for something new to discover. The woods behind our house stretched for miles, connecting to state forest land that went all the way to the next county. Dad had taught me the basics of staying safe out there. How to read the sun to know which direction I was heading, what poison ivy looked like, and most importantly, to always come back before dark. Mountains got their own rules after sunset, he'd say. And even at 7, I understood he wasn't just talking about getting lost. Our chickens were Dad's pride and joy, even though he'd never admit it. He'd built their coop himself from reclaimed lumber, complete with nesting boxes and a little door that automatically closed at sunset. Every morning before his bus route, he'd scatter, feed, and check for eggs. Those chickens had names: Henrietta, Clucks, Big Bertha, and Dad knew each one's personality. Mom used to tease him about talking to them like they were people, but it was one of those family jokes that made everything feel normal and safe. It was a Tuesday in early September when everything changed. School had just started, so Dad's schedule was busier than usual with new routes to memorize. Mom had picked up extra shifts at the diner because tourist season was ending and tips were getting scarce. I'd spent the afternoon after school doing what I always did, exploring the woods while Emma napped and Mom did housework. That's when I found the hole. It was behind the chicken coop, maybe 30 feet into the tree line, in a small clearing I'd never really paid attention to before. The hole was perfectly round, about 3 feet across, with edges so smooth they looked almost carved. What struck me most was how black it was inside. I mean, completely black. Even in the late afternoon sun, my shadow didn't seem to make the darkness any deeper. I remember kneeling at the edge, trying to see how deep it went. I had a small flashlight on my keychain, one of those cheap ones Dad had bought at the hardware store, and when I shined it down, the beam just seemed to disappear. It was like looking into empty space, if that makes any sense. No bottom, no sides visible, just darkness that swallowed light. Being 7 and curious, I did what any kid would do. I found a good-sized rock and dropped it in, counting like Dad had taught me to figure out distance. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi, nothing. No sound of it hitting bottom, no echo, no splash if there was water down there, just silence. That should have been my first warning. But then I heard something that made my skin crawl. It wasn't an echo from the rock. It was more like someone smacking their lips really loudly, like they were tasting something delicious. The sound lasted maybe 3 seconds, then stopped. I backed away from the hole pretty quick after that, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. During dinner, while Dad talked about his new bus route and Mom complained about a difficult customer at the diner, I kept wondering what could make a sound like that. Maybe it was some kind of underground stream or wind moving through rock formations. There had to be a logical explanation. Over the next few days, I visited the hole every chance I got. It became like an obsession. I'd finish my chores, tell Mom I was going to play in the woods, and head straight back to that clearing. Each time, I'd test it differently. Bigger rocks, smaller pebbles, even a stick I found. Everything just vanished into the darkness without a sound. But the chickens started disappearing. At first, Dad figured it was foxes, or maybe a hawk. "Circle of life," he said when Mom mentioned that Henrietta hadn't come back to roost one evening. But then Clucks vanished 2 days later, and then Big Bertha. What was strange was the pattern. The chickens that disappeared were always the ones that liked to wander closest to the woods. The ones that stayed near the house were fine. I started paying more attention to which chickens went missing, and I noticed something that made my stomach turn. They were disappearing in almost a perfect circle around the hole, starting with the ones that foraged closest to it and working outward, like something was taking them in order of convenience. On the 4th day after I'd found the hole, I was sitting at its edge again, trying to work up the courage to drop something bigger down it. Maybe my baseball to see if I could hear it bounce, when I heard a voice. "Bobby? Bobby Miller?" I nearly jumped out of my skin. The voice was coming from inside the hole, drifting up from the darkness like smoke. It sounded like a kid, maybe my age, but there was something off about it. The words were too wet, like the person was talking with a mouth full of spit. "Who's down there?" I called, my voice cracking. "A friend," the voice replied, and I could hear what sounded like a smile in it. "I've been waiting so long for someone to find me. I've been so lonely down here, Bobby, so very lonely." "How do you know my name?" "I know lots of things. I know you live in the White House with the green shutters. I know your daddy drives the big yellow bus. I know your mama makes the best biscuits in 3 counties. There was a pause, then. "I know you've been feeding my chickens." My heart started pounding. "Those aren't your chickens, they're ours." "Are they?" The voice giggled, a sound that made my teeth ache. "They come visit me all the time now. They're much better company than the mice and rabbits, but they're not enough anymore. I'm still so hungry, Bobby, so terribly hungry. I should have run right then. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to get away from that hole and never come back. But there was something about the voice that kept me frozen in place. It sounded so sad, so lonely. And I was 7 years old, raised to help people who were hurt or lost. "Are you stuck down there?" I asked. "Oh no," the voice said, and this time I definitely heard amusement. "I live down here. I've lived down here for a very, very long time. But it gets so lonely, especially when the seasons change and all the little animals go to sleep. That's when I get the hungriest." Over the following days, I kept coming back. I know that sounds stupid now, but the voice was always so friendly, so interested in hearing about my day. It asked about school, about Emma, about what Mom cooked for dinner. Sometimes, it would tell me stories about the old days, about families who used to live on our land before we moved here. There was a little girl named Sarah who used to play right where you're sitting, it told me one afternoon. She had pigtails just like your sister Emma. Such a sweet child. We played the most wonderful games together. Where is she now? Oh, she's still here. They're all still here, in a way. We play together all the time down in my beautiful home. That's when I started finding the bones. They were arranged in little piles around the hole, hidden under fallen leaves where you'd only notice them if you were really looking. Chicken bones. Mostly, but picked completely clean and sorted by size. Leg bones in one pile, wing bones in another, skulls in a third, like someone was keeping a collection. But there were other bones too. Longer ones that didn't look like they came from chickens. Some looked like they might be from deer or dogs. And a few, I still get sick thinking about this, looked like they might have come from something bigger. Something that walked on 2 legs. "I see you found my treasures," the voice said the next time I visited. I hadn't said anything about the bones, but somehow it knew I'd seen them. "What are they?" "Memories," it replied. "Beautiful memories of all my friends who came to play. I keep them close, so I won't forget." "Did you hurt them?" "Hurt them?" The voice sounded genuinely surprised. "Oh no, Bobby, I would never hurt a friend. I just kept them. We had such wonderful times together that I couldn't bear to let them leave. They're much happier now, here with me, where it's safe and warm, and they never have to worry about anything ever again." I started having nightmares after that. Dreams about falling into darkness, about voices calling my name, about Emma wandering toward the woods while I screamed for her to stop. I'd wake up sweating and check her room to make sure she was still safe in her bed. The voice started asking about Emma more often. "Your little sister sounds so sweet," it would say. "I bet she'd love to see my home down here. Little girls always appreciate beautiful things more than boys do. Does she like games, Bobby? I know so many wonderful games." "She's too little," I'd say quickly. "She doesn't like the woods. Bring her anyway. Just for a visit. I promise she'd have the most amazing time. Children who come to play with me never want to leave." I bet they don't, I thought, remembering those bone piles. But the worst part was that Emma had started asking about the woods. She'd never shown interest before, always preferring to stay close to the house, but suddenly she was curious about where I went every day. She'd ask if she could come with me, if there were any flowers to pick back there, if I'd seen any rabbits. "Something's calling me," she said one evening while we were playing with her dolls on the front porch. "In the trees. It sounds like singing, but I can't understand the words." My blood turned to ice. The thing in the hole was reaching out to her somehow, maybe learning to throw its voice or project it at night when the house was quiet. I started watching Emma constantly, making excuses to stay inside, trying to keep her distracted with games and stories. But I was just 7 years old myself. I couldn't watch her every second. One afternoon, I came home from helping Dad with his after-school bus checks to find Mom in a panic. Emma was missing. She'd been playing in the backyard while Mom started dinner, and when Mom looked outside 10 minutes later, she was gone. "Emma," Mom was calling, her voice getting higher and more desperate. "Emma, where are you?" I knew exactly where she was. I ran toward the woods faster than I'd ever run before, branches whipping my face and roots trying to trip me up. Behind me, I could hear Mom calling Dad on his radio, her voice breaking as she tried to explain that our 4-year-old sister had vanished. When I reached the clearing, I saw Emma's little pink shoe at the edge of the hole. "Emma!" I screamed into the darkness. "Bobby?" Her voice drifted up from below, small and scared, and so far away it made my chest hurt. "Bobby, I can't get out. The pretty man said there would be flowers down here, but it's all dark and scary." "Don't worry, baby," I called. "I'm coming to get you." "Oh, wonderful." That other voice, the hungry one, echoed up from the depths. "I was hoping you'd join us, Bobby. Now we can all be friends together. Forever and ever and ever." I looked around frantically for something to help. Dad's tool shed was too far away, and I didn't have time to run back for rope. But then I remembered the old climbing rope he kept in the back of his pickup truck, the one he used for hauling hay bales. I sprinted to the driveway, my lungs burning, and grabbed the rope from Dad's truck bed. It was thick and strong, maybe 40 feet long, hopefully long enough. I tied one end around the biggest tree I could find near the hole and tested the knot like Dad had taught me. "I'm coming down, Emma," I called. "Stay where you are." "Hurry, Bobby," she cried. "The pretty man is getting closer, and he has such big teeth." I lowered myself into the hole hand over hand, the rope burning my palms. The darkness was complete after the first few feet, and the air got colder and damper the further down I went. There was a smell, too, something sweet and rotten, like flowers left too long in water. The rope ended while I was still dangling in empty space, but I could hear Emma crying somewhere below me. I called her name and heard her voice maybe 10 feet down and to the left. I let go of the rope and dropped, hitting rocky ground hard enough to knock the breath out of me. When my eyes adjusted, I realized I wasn't in a narrow hole anymore. I was in a vast underground chamber, so big my voice echoed when I called for Emma. Phosphorescent moss on the walls provided just enough light to see shapes, and those shapes made me want to throw up. Bones everywhere. Not just animal bones this time, but human skulls and rib cages and femurs, all arranged in careful patterns like some kind of grotesque art project. Some of the bones looked old, stained dark brown with age. Others looked much newer. "Emma, where are you?" "Over here," her voice came from a side passage to my left. I crawled toward it, trying not to look too closely at the bone arrangements, trying not to think about how many friends this thing had collected over the years. I found Emma in a smaller chamber, huddled against the wall and crying. She wasn't hurt, just terrified, and she threw herself into my arms the moment she saw me. "I want to go home," she sobbed. The pretty man lied. "There are no flowers here, just bones and scary smells." "We're going home right now," I promised her. But as I picked her up, something moved in the shadows at the far end of the chamber. It looked like a child at first glance, maybe 10 or 11 years old, but wrong in every possible way. Its skin was the color of old mushrooms, gray-white and slightly translucent. Its limbs were too long for its body, and its fingers ended in what looked like black claws. But it was the face that made me freeze with terror. The features were human enough: eyes, nose, mouth, but stretched and distorted like someone had grabbed a normal face and pulled it in all directions. The mouth was the worst part. When it smiled at us, it opened far wider than any human mouth should, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth that went back into its throat like a lamprey. "Bobby," it said in that wet, hungry voice I'd been hearing for weeks, "I'm so glad you came to visit my home. Isn't it beautiful? I've been decorating it for so very long." "Let us go," I said, surprised that my voice worked at all. "We just want to go home." "But this is your home now," the thing said, tilting its head at an angle that would have broken a normal person's neck. "You're my friends, and friends stay together forever. I've been so lonely for so long, and now I have 2 wonderful playmates. We're going to have such amazing times. You can't keep us here, can't I?" It gestured around at the bone-decorated chamber. "I kept all of them. Sarah lasted almost a whole year before she stopped being fun to play with. The others lasted even longer. You're both so young and full of life. I bet we could play games for decades before you get too tired to continue." Emma whimpered against my shoulder, and I realized the thing wasn't just planning to kill us. It was planning to keep us alive down here, in this horrible place, feeding off our fear and life force until we eventually died of despair or starvation. And then, our bones would join the collection. But I also realized something else. The thing was excited, almost giddy with the prospect of having 2 permanent playmates. It wasn't thinking clearly, wasn't being as careful as it probably should have been. "What if I could bring you more friends?" I said quickly. "It's my birthday next week. There's going to be a party with 6 or 7 kids from school. If you let Emma go now, I'll bring all of them back here tomorrow." The creature's horrible eyes lit up like Christmas morning. "More friends? Oh, Bobby, that would be wonderful. I haven't had a proper party in so very long. But you have to let Emma go first," I insisted. "She's too little to understand about keeping secrets. If she tells Mom and Dad about this place, they'll never let the other kids come to my party." The thing considered this, its head tilting back and forth like a bird of prey. "You promise you'll bring them? All of them?" "I promise. And you'll come back too? You won't try to run away and leave me lonely again?" "I'll come back," I lied. "Tomorrow night, after everyone's asleep." The creature clapped its hands together with delight, a sound like breaking sticks. "Oh, this will be the best party ever. I'll prepare special games for everyone, special treats. They'll never want to leave." The thing actually helped boost Emma and me up to where I could reach the rope. I climbed first, then pulled Emma up after me, my arms shaking with exhaustion and terror. The creature called cheerful goodbyes from below, reminding me about our party and how excited it was to meet my friends. The moment we got out of that hole, I screamed for Dad with every ounce of air in my lungs. He came running from the house, Mom right behind him, and when they saw Emma's condition and the terror on both our faces, Dad's expression changed to something I'd never seen before. Hard and dangerous and absolutely believing. "What happened?" he demanded. I told him everything. The voice in the hole, the missing chickens, the bones, the creature that wanted to keep us as permanent playmates. Most adults would have thought I was making it up or had a nightmare, but Dad grew up in these mountains. He knew there were things in the deep places that were older and hungrier than human understanding. "Stay here with your mother," he told me, then ran to his pickup truck. Dad backed that truck right up to the edge of the hole and started dumping in every bag of concrete we had in the barn. 50-pound bags, one after another, while the thing below screamed and raged and promised terrible things. When we ran out of concrete, Dad got on his radio and started calling every construction worker and contractor he knew. Within 2 hours, we had a convoy of trucks in our backyard. Dad's friends didn't ask many questions, just brought concrete, rebar, gravel, anything that would fill that hole and make sure it stayed filled. The whole community seemed to understand that this was something that needed to be done quickly and permanently. Some of the older men mentioned things while they worked. Stories about children who'd gone missing over the years, about strange sounds from deep in the woods, about spots where the hunting dogs refused to go. Nobody said it directly, but I got the impression that people had been waiting for someone to find that hole and seal it up. We poured concrete until the hole was filled to ground level, then laid rebar on top and poured more. By the time we were finished, there was a solid concrete plug 15 feet deep where that nightmare entrance used to be. Dad covered it with topsoil and planted grass seed, but he still checks it every week to make sure the concrete hasn't cracked or shifted. That was 18 years ago, and I've never forgotten the sound of that thing screaming as we sealed it in. Sometimes I wonder if it's still down there, still hungry, still waiting. Dad says it probably starved to death once its hunting ground was cut off, but I'm not so sure. Things that old and patient don't die easily. Emma doesn't remember much about what happened. She was only 4, and I think her mind just blocked out the worst parts. But she's never been comfortable in the woods, and she lives in Richmond now with her husband and kids. Says she likes the city better, with its streetlights and constant noise and places where you're never really alone. I stayed on the family land, but I built my house on the far side of the property, as far from that sealed hole as I can get. My own kids play in our front yard, never in the backwoods. They think I'm being overprotective, and maybe I am. But I remember what's buried under that concrete. And I know there are other holes in these mountains, other hungry things waiting for curious children to find them. Sometimes, late at night when the wind is right, I swear I can still hear something calling from underground. It might just be my imagination, or maybe the sound of water moving through limestone caves. But I don't take chances. Some hungers are too old and too patient to stay buried forever, and some holes in the ground should never be explored. I never did have that birthday party, by the way. Couldn't bring myself to invite other kids over, knowing what I'd promised to that thing. Even sealed in concrete and rebar, the thought of breaking my word to it makes my skin crawl. Some promises are too dangerous to break, even when you never intended to keep them. These days, when my own kids ask why they can't play in the backwoods, I tell them the truth. Not all of it. They're too young for the worst details, but enough to keep them safe. There are things in the deep places of these mountains that are older than human memory and hungrier than human understanding. And sometimes, the only thing that stands between us and them is knowing which holes in the ground should stay filled.